He married her not out of love, but to avenge his father who had betrayed his younger brother to the police. Seraphine Vale walked down the aisle with lifeless eyes, like someone who had long since given up hope of survival. Kael Virelli, the most notorious Mafia boss on the East Coast, wanted to see fear on her face. But what he saw was even more terrifying: utter emptiness. Then, on their wedding night, when the bathroom door burst open, he stood frozen. Her back was covered in scars. Not accidents, systematic torture. And from that moment, everything he believed in began to crumble. Please leave a comment with the city you're watching in, so I know how far this story has come. And don't go anywhere, because this is just the beginning. The rain came down like punishment. It had been falling since 4 in the morning, sheeting across the cathedral's stone facade in thick diagonal waves that drowned the gutters and turned the cobblestones outside into shallow rivers. By 7, the streets surrounding Blackmore Cathedral were barricaded by men in black suits, with earpieces and expressionless faces. And by 9, every pew inside the building was filled with people who had no business being in the same room together. Politicians sat beside men who bribed them. Prosecutors who had never won a case against the Virelli family sat 3 rows from Dominic Farah, Kael's chief enforcer, who had personally ensured they never would. A sitting state senator adjusted his cufflinks and pretended not to notice the man behind him whose name appeared in 3 sealed federal indictments. They were all here because Kael Virelli had told them to be. And no one in that city told Kael Virelli no. He stood at the altar now, hands loosely clasped in front of him, and the word that came to mind when people described him in whispered conversations was never handsome or powerful or even dangerous. The word was still. Kael Virelli was the kind of still that predators achieved right before a strike, a quality of attention so complete and so focused that it registered in the body before the mind could process it. He was 38 years old. He had dark hair going slightly gray at the temples, a jaw that looked like it had been cut rather than grown, and eyes the color of old pewter that had never once, in living memory, communicated warmth. His suit was black, his tie was black. The pocket square was the only concession to the occasion, ivory white, pressed to a knife-edge fold. Marco, standing 2 feet to his left and slightly behind, leaned forward half an inch. "She's at the door," Marco murmured. Kael didn't turn. "I know." He could feel it in the room. The shift in atmosphere that occurred when 200 people simultaneously decided to hold their breath. The organ music climbed 1 register. Somewhere behind him, heels clicked against marble, slow and measured, and the guests turned in their seats with the synchronized movement of people watching something they'd been promised was going to be ugly. Kael turned last. Seraphine Vale walked toward him in a white silk gown with long sleeves despite the summer heat pressing against every stained glass pane in the building. Her hair was dark and pulled away from her face, and the veil was simple, not theatrical, not elaborate, just a thin layer of gauze between her face and the world. She carried no flowers. She had refused them. He'd been told this through a terse message from his own event coordinator that morning, and the detail had struck him as the first genuinely interesting thing anyone had communicated to him about Seraphine Vale in the 6 weeks since he'd arranged this spectacle. He watched her walk. He had expected her father's daughter. He had expected the practiced composure of a woman raised in the company of powerful men. A particular brand of controlled grace that was essentially a performance of not needing anything from anyone. He had expected underneath that fear, the kind that lived in the jaw and the shoulders, the kind that people from comfortable lives wore when they suddenly understood what real exposure to men like Kael actually meant. What he saw instead was a woman who looked like she had already survived something far worse than him. Her face beneath the veil was still in a way that had nothing to do with composure. It was the stillness of total resource depletion. The face of someone who had burned through every available form of emotional fuel and arrived at a state that wasn't peace and wasn't strength, but was something harder than both. Her eyes, dark and direct beneath the gauze, moved across the assembled crowd without acknowledgement, without calculation, without the flicker of recognition that most people couldn't suppress when scanning a room full of people who held their fate. She looked at the senators and the crime lords and the corrupt men her father had spent decades cultivating with the same flat attention she gave the marble floor. Then she looked at Kael. He had expected something from that moment. He'd planned it, in a way, not consciously, but in the part of himself that organized the world around the ledger of debts and repayments he'd been maintaining since he was 19 years old. This was the moment of completion. 6 years of work, of building, of patience so cold it had replaced most of what he remembered about being a person. He had expected to feel it land. What he felt instead was a specific kind of unease he couldn't immediately identify. She reached him. The officiant said whatever officiants say. Kael heard none of it. He was too busy watching her breathe, the shallow, controlled rise of her chest, the slight tightening at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite expression, the way her hands remained perfectly steady when she should have been shaking. She answered the required words in a voice that was low and even and inflectionless, as if she were reciting something she'd memorized years ago and had rehearsed so many times it no longer meant anything at all. When he placed the ring on her finger, she looked down at it with a brief clinical attention, the way someone notes an injury they'll need to address later when they have time. The kiss was a performance for the room. He knew it. She knew it. He kept it brief and impersonal, and when he pulled back and looked at her face, what he found was nothing. No revulsion, no relief, no humiliation, no anger. Nothing. The crowd applauded. Champagne was opened somewhere behind the cathedral, the pop of it swallowed by the continuing percussion of rain against stone. Men who had spent careers opposing each other clinked glasses. The senator adjusted his cufflinks again. Dominic Farah clapped twice, slowly, watching Kael with the complicated expression of a man who had executed Kael's orders for 15 years and had learned to read the small deviations before they became large ones. Kael walked his wife down the aisle of Blackmore Cathedral and did not look at Judge Aldrich Vale, who sat in the third row on the bride's side and watched his daughter's exit with an expression of quiet, proprietary satisfaction that most people in the room mistook for parental emotion. The penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of a building that Kael owned outright and had modified for security purposes to a degree that would have required extensive permitting had he applied for any of it. 43rd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows along the south and east faces, a view of the harbor that on clear days extended to the open Atlantic, and tonight showed only the black belly of the storm pressing down on a city that seemed to be trying to sink into the ocean. The wedding reception had lasted 4 hours. Kael had stood in it with the patience of a man serving a sentence he'd imposed on himself, accepted congratulations from people who meant none of them, and tracked Seraphine from across every room she moved through without appearing to. She had eaten almost nothing. She had accepted a glass of champagne and carried it for 2 hours without drinking more than 2 sips. She had spoken when spoken to and answered questions in complete sentences that revealed nothing and invited no follow-up. At 11, she had appeared at his elbow. "I'd like to leave," she said. Not a request exactly. A statement of intent delivered in a tone calibrated not to create conflict. "Fine," Kael said. In the car, she sat against the opposite door and looked out at the rain-slicked streets, with her hands folded in her lap, and neither of them said anything for the 20-minute drive. Kael's driver, a former military operative named Soren, who had been with him for 9 years, did not make conversation. The security vehicle behind them maintained its distance. In the elevator, she asked, "Which room is mine?" Kael looked at her. "I'll show you." The penthouse had a primary suite and 4 guest rooms, which he had previously considered excessive and now reconsidered as possibly insufficient. He walked her to the suite he designated, the larger of the guest rooms, converted with new furniture and a private bathroom, as far from his own room as the floor plan permitted. He'd made that decision without fully examining why and was not in the habit of examining his own decisions once made. "There's a security panel inside the closet," he said, standing in the doorway. "The code is 7471. Don't open the front door for anyone who doesn't come through Soren first. There are 2 emergency contacts programmed into the phone on the nightstand." She looked at the room without entering it immediately. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're in my building now. What happens to you reflects on me." Something moved across her face, not quite amusement, not quite contempt, something in the territory between them. "Of course," she said. She went inside. He turned to leave. He heard the sound 2 minutes later, the high, clean crack of crystal against tile, followed by a brief, bitten-off sound that might have been a word. He stood outside the bathroom door. The instinct that had kept him alive through things that should have killed him cataloged the sound and identified it as accidental rather than distress. and the rational calculation he operated on said to keep walking. Instead, he knocked once, got no answer within 3 seconds, and pushed the door open. She had her back to him. She was in the process of changing, her dress partially unzipped, the long sleeves still covering her arms. The silk pooled at her waist. She had turned toward the sound of the door with a full-body flinch that she immediately suppressed, her hands going rigid at her sides, her chin lifting with the mechanical precision of someone executing a trained response. Her back was exposed from the base of her shoulder blades to the knot of fabric at her waist. Kael had seen violence in many of its forms and expressions. He had seen what it left behind on human bodies. He was not a man given to shock. It was a luxury he had rationalized out of himself years ago, along with several other responses that interfered with function. He stood very still in the doorway and looked at what 6, 7, 8 years of systematic abuse had recorded on the back of the woman he had married that afternoon to satisfy a debt she had no part in creating. The scars were not random. That was the thing that went through him first. That was the thing that would stay with him longest in the hours and days that followed. Random injuries told one story. The pattern on her back told another. Burn marks that had been placed with deliberate spacing. Welts from a belt that had fallen in overlapping lines, left to heal and then reopened. Something bladed that had gone shallow and long across her right shoulder, carefully enough to scar without damaging anything beneath. Old fractures recorded in the slight asymmetry of her posture, bones that had knit themselves without proper setting. This had been done over time, by someone with consistent access, by someone who knew exactly how much damage to leave visible and how much to conceal beneath fabric. "Close the door," she said. Her voice was entirely flat. Kael did not close the door. "Seraphine, close the door." A fraction harder this time. He closed it from the inside, which was not what she'd meant. He heard her exhale, sharp and controlled, the breath of someone managing. "What do you want?" she said. It wasn't a question. To know how this happened. It didn't happen to me. She reached for the dress where it was slipping, caught it, held it against her chest without turning around. "It was done to me. There's a difference. Now get out." "Who?" "I said get out." She turned then, finally, and looked at him over her shoulder with the dead-level attention of someone who has learned that requests are never enough with certain kinds of men, and that the only language that sometimes works is something harder. "You got what you wanted today. A transaction was completed. We can discuss whatever you think you need to discuss in the morning when I'm dressed. Right now, I'd like you to leave my room." Kael stood there for a moment that was several seconds longer than comfort. Then he left. But he did not sleep. He sat in the dark of his study on the north side of the penthouse with a glass of scotch that he didn't drink, and looked at the storm-compressed skyline and ran through what he knew about Judge Aldrich Vale's relationship with his daughter with a precision that felt almost clinical until it didn't anymore. The public record was unremarkable in its careful construction. Aldrich Vale had served on the federal bench for 23 years. He was known for strict, consistent sentencing, for a biography that emphasized his childhood in a working-class family in the old city, a narrative that had survived 3 decades of professional exposure precisely because no one had looked beneath it with any real intention of finding what was there. He had been widowed when Seraphine was 4 years old. He had raised her publicly with the combination of distance and occasional display that powerful men often passed off as parenting. She had appeared at political events and fundraising dinners from the time she was a teenager, always dressed appropriately, always saying the correct things, never drawing attention to herself in the wrong directions. The file Kael had assembled on Vale when he'd started planning his approach to this revenge 3 years ago contained financial irregularities, judicial conflicts of interest, and a documented series of case outcomes that strongly implied coordination with organized crime networks, specifically with the Garante Syndicate, which had operated through Vale's jurisdiction for a decade and a half with a success rate in criminal proceedings that defied statistical probability. What the file did not contain, what Kael had not thought to look for because he had been looking at Vale as a target rather than as a person, was anything that accounted for what he had just seen in that bathroom. He pulled out his phone and sent a single message to the number he used for research that couldn't go through official channels. Everything you can find on Vale's household records. Property, staff turnover, medical providers, private security contracts. Seraphine Vale specifically. Go back 10 years. The reply came in 40 seconds. By morning, He put the phone down and looked at the scotch and thought about the sound she had made after the crystal broke, that brief, involuntary syllable, and the way she had suppressed it immediately, not with embarrassment, but with the mechanical efficiency of someone who had learned that sounds invited consequences. He thought about the way she had flinched when he'd pushed the door open. He thought about the word she'd used, done to me. Not past tense with grief attached. Past tense the way you described weather, the way you described geography. It was done to me the way a river describes what gravity does to it. He didn't sleep until 4, and when he did, it was in the chair. In the morning, she was already in the kitchen. He found her at the counter with a cup of coffee, dressed in plain dark clothes, her hair pulled back, the long sleeves again. She looked at him when he came in with an expression of neutral appraisal, the way people look at weather they've already decided how to deal with. "Coffee," she said, nodding toward the machine. "A statement, not an offer. It's there if you want it." He poured a cup and stood across the island from her and tried to read her the way he read people, which was something he was very good at and which was not working on her the way it worked on other people. She had no tells. Or rather, she had one tell, a slight millisecond stillness when anything in her environment changed unexpectedly. And he recognized it immediately as a survival adaptation rather than a social one. She had been trained by something worse than any interrogation to register threat before it arrived. "The file came in this morning," he said. Something shifted in her face. Too fast to name. "What file?" "I had research run on your father's household records going back 10 years. Medical histories, staff turnover." She set the coffee cup down with a deliberate, even movement. "You had me investigated." "I had him investigated." Kael watched her. "You were incidental, but what came back wasn't." A silence opened between them that had weight to it. 3 household staff in 7 years, he said. All women, all from placement agencies Vale had financial relationships with. All with signed NDAs as a condition of employment. Your personal physician for the years between age 14 and 22 was Vale's personal physician, a man who has since had his license revoked in 2 states for falsifying records. You had 6 documented emergency room visits in that period. 5 listed cause of injury as domestic accidents. And the 6th? Her voice was entirely level. Listed as a fall. Kael paused. From a second-floor window. She picked up the coffee cup again. Drank. Set it down. "What do you want from this conversation?" she said. "I want to understand what I married." Something crossed her face that he couldn't entirely name. Not anger, not pain. Something more comprehensive than either. She looked at him across the kitchen island with those dark, resource-depleted eyes and said, "You married a tool your enemy pointed at you. That's what you wanted. That's what you got. Don't complicate it now because your conscience woke up late." "I don't have a conscience," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we understand each other." She took her coffee and left the kitchen. He stood there for a moment, looking at the countertop where her cup had been, and felt something moving in him that he had spent a very long time building walls against. It wasn't sympathy. Sympathy was useless, and he had no patience for it. It was something more structural, a reorientation of understanding, the way a map changes when a new survey reveals that the road you thought went one direction actually ends in a cliff. He had married Seraphine Vale to hurt her father. Her father had already spent a decade doing things to her that Kael would have considered excessive even by the standards of men who used pain as a professional instrument. He stood in the kitchen and reconsidered, with the cold and systematic attention he applied to problems that required new approaches, everything he thought he knew about what he was doing here. Death. The first week was a negotiation conducted entirely without words. She moved through his penthouse like someone mapping a territory for escape routes, quietly, methodically, without apparent urgency. He caught her twice in the first 3 days, running her hands along window frames. Not nervously, calmly, the way an engineer assesses a structure. He watched her locate every camera, every entrance point, every position where a person could stand with a full line of sight to both exits. He watched her take the handle of the largest kitchen knife and weigh it briefly, with the same clinical attention she gave everything before returning it to the block. He said nothing. He understood what she was doing. He had done it himself in every new environment for the first 15 years of his adult life, and in some diminished form continued to do it now out of habit. On the fourth day, Marco came to the penthouse for a briefing and made the mistake of entering the study without announcing himself first. Seraphine, who had been reading in the chair nearest the door, was on her feet with her back to the far wall and one hand behind her before Marco had fully registered her presence. "Sorry," Marco said, putting both hands up with genuine alarm. "I didn't. Sorry." She lowered her hand slowly. "Don't do that again," she said. The flat calm of it was somehow more commanding than anger would have been. Marco looked at Kael. "Close the door on your way out," Kael said. "I'll come to you." Later in the corridor, Marco said, "She had something in her hand." "I know," Kael said. "Should we?" "No." Marco absorbed this. He had worked for Kael long enough to understand the weight of certain short answers. "Okay," he said. On the sixth night, Kael woke at 2 a.m. to a sound he couldn't immediately identify. Faint, rhythmic, positioned somewhere between his room and the main corridor. He moved to the door and opened it without making noise and stood in the hallway in the dark and listened. It was her breathing. She was sitting on the floor of the corridor outside her door with her back against the wall, knees drawn up, the small knife from the kitchen block resting across her thighs. Her eyes were open, and she was looking at nothing in particular with the focused non-attention of someone writing out something internal. Her chest rose and fell in the shallow, controlled pattern he was beginning to recognize as her default under stress. Every door in the corridor was closed. He knew, without checking, that she had checked the locks on all of them before sitting down. He should have gone back to his room. Instead, he walked down the corridor and sat down against the wall 6 feet from her, in the dark, and said nothing. She didn't look at him. Her hand closed slightly on the knife. Then after several seconds, she let the grip go back to loose. They sat in the corridor for 40 minutes. He said nothing. She said nothing. At some point, her breathing evened out, and the sharp attention quality left her posture. She stood, gathered the knife, and went back into her room and closed the door. He sat in the corridor for a few minutes longer. Then he went back to his room and lay in the dark and understood, with a clarity that felt like a problem rather than a resolution, that something about his original plan had already been irrevocably altered, and that the full extent of what he'd built his revenge on was nowhere near what he'd believed it to be. He needed to know everything. He pulled out his phone. His "Go deeper," he sent. Everything on Vale, every contract, every name, every property he's ever had access to, every person who spent significant time in that household. I want all of it. A pause. "This is going to get ugly," came the reply. "I know," Kael sent back. He put the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling and waited for the morning and the information it would bring and the thing he already knew it was going to tell him, that the revenge he had spent 6 years constructing had been aimed at the wrong part of the wound entirely. Below the penthouse, 43 floors down, the city shuddered in the rain like something that had been holding its breath for a very long time and was finally starting to exhale. And somewhere in the harbor district, in a townhouse with security cameras and a private line to 3 sitting judges, Aldrich Vale poured himself a glass of brandy and smiled at the storm outside his window with the quiet satisfaction of a man who believed, completely and without doubt, that he still controlled every piece on the board. He had no idea what was coming for him, but it had already begun. The file arrived at 6:14 in the morning. Kael was already at his desk when his encrypted phone vibrated twice, the signal for high-volume delivery. And he opened the attached documents with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things he suspected were going to change the shape of something. He had been awake since 4. He had made coffee he hadn't drunk and stood at the east window and watched the storm finally exhaust itself over the harbor, leaving behind the gray, wrung-out sky of early morning and streets still running with water. He read for 2 hours without stopping. By the time he put the phone down, his coffee was cold, and the gray outside had warmed to a flat, colorless dawn, and Kael Virelli, who had not experienced anything he would have called shock since he was 22 years old, sat very still at his desk with his hands flat on the surface and breathed through what the documents had done to his understanding of the last 6 years. The research was thorough. His contact, a former intelligence analyst who worked exclusively for cash and never asked what the information was for, had gone deep into the architecture of Aldrich Vale's private life and come back with a structure that was nothing like the public record. property holdings under 3 different shell companies, 2 of which were traceable, with effort, to entities connected to the Garante Syndicate's financial network, a private medical account that had processed payments to a physician whose name did not appear in any official capacity, but whose coded billing records, once translated, described a clinical history for a female dependent between the ages of 14 and 23 that made Kael's jaw go tight in a way he couldn't immediately release. There was more. He didn't rush through it. He read every page with the slow, total attention of someone building a new map on top of a destroyed one, laying new coordinates over the ruins of the old. The household staff NDAs. The patterns of isolation, school withdrawal at 16, no documented social activity for 18 months during what would have been her junior year of high school, a period that corresponded exactly with a cluster of medical billing entries that his contact had flagged in red. Private tutors who had signed the same standardized NDA as the household staff. A single police incident report from 7 years ago, filed by a neighbor and subsequently closed without follow-up, that described a disturbance at the Vale residence on a Tuesday evening in November. Closed without follow-up. Vale had been a sitting federal judge. Kael sat at his desk and looked at his hands and understood that the man he had spent 6 years planning to destroy for what he'd done to Dario had been doing something arguably worse to his own daughter for twice that long, and that everyone with the power or the position to have done something about it had looked away, looked down, looked anywhere else, because Aldrich Vale was the kind of man who made looking away the safest available option. He thought about Seraphine sitting on the corridor floor at 2 a.m. with a kitchen knife across her thighs. He thought about Done to Me and the inflectionless precision of it. He pushed back from the desk, stood up, and walked to the kitchen to make fresh coffee. It was something to do with his hands. He was not a man who needed things to do with his hands, but this morning, in this particular reconfiguration of what he was dealing with, the simple mechanics of grinding beans and running water felt necessary. He heard her before he saw her, the soft, practiced sound of someone moving through a space they've learned to navigate without making noise. She appeared in the kitchen doorway in the same plain dark clothes, hair down this morning, and stopped when she saw him already there, a half-second recalibration. Then she moved to the counter and reached for a cup. "I need to ask you something," Kael said. She poured water. "No. I haven't asked it yet." "Whatever the file told you," she said, "the answer is that it's not your business, it's not your problem, and I'd prefer you keep it in whatever folder it came from and leave it there. It's become my business." She turned around and looked at him with the flat, tired patience of someone who has had this particular category of conversation before and found it uniformly useless. "Because you married me." "Right. And now you feel, what? Responsible?" "I feel like I need to understand what I'm dealing with." "You're dealing with a woman who survived her father," she said. "That's all you need to know. That's all there is. The medical records are mine." Something sharpened in her voice without raising in volume. "They happened to my body. They belong to me. You don't get access to them because you paid for a wedding and now you're feeling guilty about your motivations. That's not how this works." Kael looked at her. "I'm not feeling guilty." "Then what are you feeling?" The question landed between them with more weight than she'd probably intended. He didn't answer it immediately because he didn't have a clean answer, which was itself unusual enough to slow him down. "Like I've been operating on incomplete information," he said finally. Something moved across her face. Not softness, nothing as simple as softness, but a slight reduction in the specific quality of wariness she maintained toward him, like a door not opening, but unlocking. "Welcome to my entire life," she said, and poured her coffee and carried it to the window. Marco came at 9 with a situation that required Kael's physical presence at the casino on Whitmore Street, which had experienced a problem in the overnight hours involving 2 of their dealers, a man from the Paluccio crew, and a quantity of cash that had not ended up where it was supposed to. Kael put on a jacket and told Soren to bring the car and paused at the kitchen doorway before leaving. Seraphine was at the table with her coffee and what appeared to be a legal document she was reading with sharp, focused attention. "Don't leave the building," he said. She looked up. "I wasn't planning to." "Soren will be back in 2 hours. If you need anything before that, there's a number in the kitchen drawer." I've been managing my own safety for longer than you've been aware I exist, she said, and went back to the document. He left. In the car, Marco glanced at him in the rearview mirror with the expression of a man forming a question and deciding against it. Say it, Kael said. I'm not saying anything. Marco, I'm just... She reads legal documents for breakfast? Apparently. Another glance. What kind of legal documents? Kael hadn't looked closely enough to read the header. He filed that away. Drive, he said. The Whitmore casino situation was resolved in 40 minutes, which involved Kael sitting across a table from the Peluccio Crew's representative, a heavy, cautious man named Sal, who sweated through his collar, even in air conditioning, and communicating, with the particular economy of expression that came from never needing to raise his voice, exactly what the consequences of further irregularities would look like. Sal nodded a great deal. The cash was returned. Certain arrangements were adjusted. On the way back, Kael's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize, which he would normally not answer. He answered it. Mr. Virelli. A voice he didn't know. Male, controlled, with the specific texture of someone accustomed to being listened to. My name isn't important. What's important is that you've recently made an acquisition that belongs to a larger set of interests than you currently understand. It would be in everyone's benefit if you thought of her as temporary. Kael was quiet for a moment. Outside the car window, the post-storm city moved past in gray and wet. Say that again, he said. Your new wife. The arrangement you believe you've made with Aldrich Vale exists inside a framework that... I heard what you said the first time. Kael's voice did not change in temperature or cadence. I wanted you to say it again so you'd have time to think about whether that was a good idea. A pause. This isn't a threat, Mr. Virelli. It's information. It's a mistake, Kael said, and ended the call. He looked at Marco. Get me everything on incoming calls to the penthouse line in the last 72 hours. And I want a full review of the perimeter on Vale's known associates. Anyone who had access to our wedding guest list, private security firms, catering, venue staff. Marco already had his own phone out. Who was that? Someone who doesn't understand yet what they've gotten involved in. Kael put his phone away and looked out the window. They will. He was back at the penthouse by noon. Seraphine was not in the kitchen or the living area. He found her in the study. His study, standing at the bookshelf on the west wall with her back to the door, running her finger along the spines of a row of books. She stopped when she heard him enter, but didn't turn immediately, which he noted. It was not the freeze of someone caught doing something wrong. It was a person finishing a thought before they re-engaged with the external world. I moved your files, she said, still not turning. I put them in the left drawer. They were in the wrong order. He looked at his desk. The files that had been stacked in a particular arrangement, one he used as a loose organizational system by urgency rather than subject, were gone from the surface. I had a system, he said. You had a pile. She turned now. In her hands was a book, one of the legal texts from the upper shelf, dense and annotated. Your system was in your head. The pile was just stress made physical. He looked at her for a moment. What were you reading this morning? She considered whether to answer. He could see the calculation happening. A filing from 6 years ago, she said. One of my father's cases. I've been collecting documents on him for 4 years. He moved into the room. Collecting them how? Carefully. She set the book on the corner of the desk. He had a private server. He was meticulous about encryption, but careless about physical access, because he never believed anyone in his household would have reason to look. He was wrong about that. You have copies of his case files. I have copies of a great many things. Her eyes held his. I told you last night, I've been surviving. Surviving isn't passive. It requires information. Kael sat down in the chair across from the desk. Not his own chair, the visitor's chair, which was not something he'd done in this room before. He looked at her and reconsidered everything about the way he'd constructed his approach to this. What do you know about the Garante Syndicate's relationship with your father? He asked. Something changed in her face. Not surprise. The opposite of surprise. The look of someone who has been waiting for a specific question and is reassessing the person asking it. More than I want to, she said. Enough to bring down 4 sitting judges, 2 state senators, and a federal prosecutor if the right person had the right access to put it in front of an untouchable investigator. She paused. I've never found the right person. You might have now, Kael said. The silence that followed was different from the previous silences between them. It had direction. Why would you help me? She said. Not suspicious, analytical. A genuine question. Because your father sold my brother to the federal government for money, Kael said. I've been building toward him for 6 years. What I have now, he nodded at the phone in his pocket, where the morning's file still sat, changes the structure of how I go at him. What you have changes it further. This isn't altruism, she said. No. You want to use what I know? Yes. She looked at him with the unsentimental appraisal that was becoming familiar to him. At least you're honest about it, she said. I'm always honest, he said. I'm just not always kind. Those aren't the same thing. Something in her face shifted, a small, involuntary movement at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile but was in its neighborhood, there and gone in under a second. No, she said. They're not. Tant. The war started on a Thursday. It didn't announce itself as war. It arrived, the way real violence usually did, as something that looked first like an accident. One of Kael's freight operations near the southern docks reported a shipping container that had been tampered with overnight, locks cut, contents documented, relocked. Nothing taken. A message in the form of demonstrated access. 2 days later, a vehicle belonging to one of his mid-level distributors was found burning on an overpass in the industrial district. The distributor himself was fine, home with his family, unaware until he got the call. But his passenger, a man named Cutter, who had worked collections for Kael for 8 years, was not in the vehicle and was not answering his phone. Cutter turned up on Friday morning outside the south entrance of Kael's Whitmore Casino. He was alive. He had been beaten with a precision that spoke of professional instruction. Maximally painful, nothing permanently damaged, every injury positioned to be visible above a collar. Around his neck, on a cord, was a folded piece of paper. The paper had 3 words on it: "We see you." Kael read it standing on the sidewalk outside the casino in the 10 o'clock sun, with Marco at his left shoulder reading it over his arm, and felt something cold and specific move through him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition. This was coordinated. This was resourced. This was not the Palucho crew or any of the standard friction points in his operation. This was someone with access to his logistics, his personnel movements, his physical locations. Someone who had been watching for long enough to know how to land the first message cleanly. He thought about the phone call in the car, an acquisition that belongs to a larger set of interests. He thought about Aldrich Vale's private server and the names his new wife had described with the flat certainty of someone reciting a list they had memorized years ago. "Get me Dominic," he said to Marco. "He's already on his way." Dominic Farah arrived at the casino within 20 minutes and stood across the table from Kael in the back office with the same compressed, deliberate energy he'd maintained through 15 years of working in Kael's orbit. Dominic was 51 years old and had the build of someone who had stayed physical past the age when most men stopped, and his face carried the specific quality of absolute reliability that Kael valued above most other human attributes. "The container job was Marcello Faust's people," Dominic said. "I'm 90% on that. Faust has been expanding his network in the dock district for 2 years, and he doesn't move without backing. The car, harder to say. Different methodology, different crew. 2 separate operations," Kael said. "Coordinated, but through a third party, not directly." Dominic set a photograph on the table. "This came through one of our contacts in the Port Authority, taken 6 days ago." The photograph showed a parking structure near the harbor. 3 vehicles. 2 men visible near the center car, faces partly obscured. "The car is registered to a company called Haverford Logistics. Haverford Logistics is a subsidiary of Vale Holdings," Kael said. Dominic looked at him. "Yes." Marco, standing near the door, made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Someone is running coordinated pressure on our operation using infrastructure connected to Vale," Kael said. He was looking at the photograph with a focused stillness. "That means either Vale is directly orchestrating this, or someone in his network is using his assets independently, or he stopped. Or the marriage spooked someone, Dominic said. Someone with access to Vale's resources who doesn't want you close to him. Someone who called me yesterday and told me to think of Seraphine as temporary. Dominic absorbed this. His jaw tightened once. They're moving fast. They're moving scared. Kael put the photograph down. Scared people make mistakes. I want 24-hour coverage on every property connected to Vale Holdings. I want names on both men in that photograph by tomorrow morning. And I want to know if Vale himself has moved from his townhouse in the last 48 hours. He hasn't, Dominic said. I've had eyes on the townhouse since the wedding. Kael looked up. Since before I asked you to. Yes, a beat. Good, Kael said. He didn't tell Seraphine immediately. He came back to the penthouse that evening and she was in the kitchen again. She seemed to gravitate toward the kitchen in the evenings. He was beginning to understand because it was the room with the most exits and the best sightlines to the front door. And she looked at his face when he came in and said, "Something happened." Not a question. "Some friction in one of my operations," he said. "Don't do that." She was looking at him with the still, direct attention that he was learning was her version of intensity. "I'm not a civilian. I've been inside information networks connected to your world for 4 years. Don't manage what you tell me like I'll fall apart." He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down at the kitchen island and told her about the container, the car, Cutter, and the phone call. He told her about Haverford Logistics and the Vale Holdings connection. He watched her face as he talked. She listened without interrupting, without expression, with the total absorption of someone filing everything into a structure they're building in real time. When he finished, she was quiet for several seconds. "Renner Voss," she said. Kael waited. "He's been my father's operational intermediary for 8 years. He runs the entities my father can't be directly connected to. Haverford is his. The Dock District expansion, that'll be Voss coordinating with Faust, because Faust owes Voss money through 2 different shell arrangements." She looked at Kael. "Voss is the one who called you. He has my father's voice patterns on file for calls like that. He uses a modulator sometimes, but if it was a direct call to your mobile, it was him personally. He's careful, but he's vain. He likes to make the calls himself." Kael stared at her. "How do you know all of this?" "Because I sat in that house for years and I listened to everything," she said. "Because when you have no power and no exits, information is the only thing you can accumulate that no one can physically take from you." She held his gaze. "I told you. I have been surviving." Surviving required a complete map of what I was surviving inside. He felt the specific recalibration that came from encountering a level of competence he hadn't anticipated and hadn't properly budgeted for. He was not a man who made this error often. "I need everything you have on Voss," he said. "I know." She stood and moved to the far counter where she opened a cabinet above the refrigerator and removed a slim, battered notebook, the kind with a hard cover, held shut with an elastic band. She set it on the island in front of him. "I've been waiting for a reason to use this." He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. 4 years, he said. 4 years, she confirmed. What followed was 3 days that restructured everything. He read the notebook in a single sitting while she answered his questions with the flat, precise delivery of a woman who had rehearsed this debrief in her own head so many times that the emotional weight of the material had been separated through sheer repetition from the factual content. Names, dates, financial flows, properties. The men who came to her father's townhouse through the private entrance on the east side of the building, whose faces she had memorized from the study window over years of careful observation. The conversations she had overheard through the particular acoustics of a house, where she had learned to exist as invisibly as possible because visibility had consequences. The picture that assembled itself from her 4 years of documentation and Kael's 6 years of investigation was larger and uglier than either of them had understood alone. Vale's network wasn't simply corruption at the judicial level. It was a systematic arrangement for protecting and facilitating a specific category of criminal enterprise, the kind that moved human beings rather than drugs or money, the kind with the highest margins and the lowest operational visibility, when the right judges were insulating it from scrutiny. On the second day, when Kael read the section of the notebook dealing with the properties Vale's shell companies had provided access to over an 8-year period, he stopped for a long time. "These addresses," he said. She was sitting across the table. She looked at his face and then at the notebook. "Yes." "These are transport hubs." "Yes." He looked up at her. "You know what moved through them." "I know what I documented," she said carefully. "I know the dates, and the volume estimates, and the names of the coordinating parties. I don't know—" She stopped. Her jaw tightened once. "I know enough." Kael set the notebook down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something whose weight has shifted mid-lift. "The Garanti Syndicate's trafficking operations ran through Vale-controlled properties," he said. It wasn't a question. "For at least 6 years that I can document," she said. "Probably longer." The silence in the room had a particular quality. He looked at her across the table and understood something else. Something about the specific category of leverage her father had been willing to use her for. Something about why a man with that level of criminal exposure would need the kind of total control he'd exercised over his own household. Something about the fear that had made looking away the permanent condition of everyone in her life. "You could have gone to someone with this," he said, "years ago." "Who?" she said. One word. The flattest possible delivery. And she was right, of course. The list of people she could have gone to with documentation of Aldrich Vale's network overlapped almost completely with the list of people in that network. The federal prosecutor was in the notebook. 2 of the judges who might have heard any case against Vale were in the notebook. The senator who chaired the oversight committee that might have investigated was in the notebook. "Me," he said. She looked at him. "I didn't know you." "You could have found me." "And told you what? That I had documentation connecting your enemy to a criminal enterprise? You would have used the information and left me where I was. I wasn't useful to you until I was married to you. That's the only reason we're having this conversation." He didn't argue with it. It was accurate. "It's not the only reason now," he said. She studied his face with the unsentimental attention he was coming to understand was simply how she processed the world, stripping everything back to its structural elements, refusing the comforting interpretations, operating only on what she could verify. "Maybe not," she said finally. "But I'm not counting on that." "Count on it," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she reached across the table and turned to the next page of the notebook. It was Dominic who brought the intelligence that changed the temperature of everything. He arrived at the penthouse on the 3rd evening unannounced, which he had not done in 3 years, and the fact of it communicated the weight of what he was carrying before he opened his mouth. Kael met him in the corridor and read his face and said, "Living room," and Dominic followed him in and stood just inside the doorway in a way that indicated he wasn't planning on sitting down. Seraphine was at the far end of the room. She made to leave. "Stay," Kael said. She stayed. Dominic looked at her, then at Kael, then said, "The trafficking route that ran through Vale's properties. It didn't terminate where we thought. The endpoint wasn't export, it was domestic. A series of facilities in the metro region operating under medical and therapeutic licensing." He paused. 3 of those facilities used Vale's court as their primary judicial protection. Rulings on licensing disputes, on civil complaints, on a child welfare investigation that was filed in 2019 and closed in 2019 within 6 weeks without findings. Kael was still. "How many people are we talking about?" he said, still building the number. "But the facilities have been operational for at least 8 years, and the smallest of them had a licensed capacity of—" Dominic stopped, recalibrated. "It's a lot of people, Kael." Something moved through the room that wasn't a sound, and wasn't a movement, but registered in the body, the same way a pressure change registers before a storm. He looked at Seraphine. Her face was absolutely still. Not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of confirmation. She had known this, or something like it. It had been somewhere in the architecture of what she'd been living inside, a fact too large and too close to fully see, but impossible to not be aware of. "There's more," Dominic said. "Say it." One of the men in the photograph from the Port Authority. "We got a name." Dominic set a folder on the table between them. He's former military, works private security contracting. He's been connected to Voss's operation for 4 years. He looked at Kael directly. His last 3 contracts were all connected to the same network, and his current assignment, according to our source at the contracting firm, Kael opened the folder. Inside was a surveillance photograph, a name, and an assignment sheet. The assignment was protection detail. The principal was Seraphine Vale. The client was her father. Kael stood with the folder in his hands and looked at the assignment sheet and felt something go very quiet inside him. The specific, clarifying quiet that preceded the moments in his life when he had made decisions that could not be unmade. He's been tracking her since before the wedding, Dominic said. The marriage didn't catch him off guard. He planned for it. He knew where she was going, and he put assets in place around the building before you. He's been watching this building, Kael said. Since the day after the wedding, yes. The folder was still in his hands. He set it down on the table with the careful precision of someone managing something larger than the physical object. He turned to Seraphine. She had read the assignment sheet from across the table. Her face was doing the thing he'd seen it do exactly twice before. Not breaking, not collapsing, but reconfiguring. Finding the new shape of a reality she'd suspected, and was now confirming, and building her next functional response around the new information with a speed and lack of self-pity that was, if he was going to be honest with himself, one of the most extraordinary things he had ever watched a person do. "He's never let me leave," she said. Her voice was even. "Not really. Every time I thought there was distance between us, it was distance he permitted." "Not this time," Kael said. She looked at him. "This time is different," he said. "Why?" she said. "Because this time he's in my building's sight line." Kael picked up his phone. "And that is the last mistake he's going to make." He called Dominic's number. Dominic was still standing 10 feet away, but this was a call that needed to be on the record. And when it connected, he said, "I want every Vale Holdings property under surveillance by midnight. I want Voss's location confirmed and held. And I want the name of every sitting official in this city who appears in that notebook." A pause on the line as Dominic processed this. "That's a significant escalation," Dominic said carefully. "Yes," Kael said. He ended the call and looked at Seraphine and felt the exact weight of the moment. The place where a decision becomes structural rather than reactive, where the thing you're doing stops being response and becomes intent. There was no going back from this. There hadn't been since he'd read that notebook. There hadn't been, if he was fully honest, since he'd stood in a bathroom doorway 6 days ago and understood for the first time what he had walked into. She was looking at him with the dark, resource-depleted eyes that no longer read to him as empty. They read as the eyes of a person who had survived by seeing clearly and was seeing clearly now. "This is going to get very bad before it gets better," she said. "Yes," he said, "and you're doing it anyway." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment in the quiet of the living room, 43 floors above a city that was already beginning to shift beneath the pressure of what was coming, and said nothing. But something in her face changed. A single, small, involuntary change in the quality of the attention she was pointing at him that meant something he didn't have a word for and didn't try to name. She picked up the notebook from the table, held it out to him. "Then you're going to need all of this," she said. He took it. And somewhere across the city, in a townhouse with cameras at every corner and a private line to men who had made their careers out of looking away, Aldrich Vale received a phone call from Renner Voss that lasted 4 minutes and ended with Vale setting down his glass of brandy and looking at the far wall of his study with the expression of a man who was beginning, very slowly, very late, to understand that something had gone wrong with his calculation. Not wrong enough to frighten him yet, but the night was still young. And in the penthouse above the harbor, the woman he had spent a decade trying to erase was sitting across a table from the most dangerous man in the city, turning pages in the dark, and what was in those pages was going to... The names in the notebook burned through the city's power structure like acid through copper wire. Slow at first, then all at once. Kael worked through the night following Dominic's revelation, not with the frantic energy of someone reacting, but with the cold, systematic focus of a man who had decided that everything he'd built over 6 years needed to be reoriented around a new center of gravity. He sat at his desk while Seraphine sat at the opposite end of the table, and they worked in a silence that had stopped being uncomfortable 3 days ago and become something more functional. Two people who had separately accumulated pieces of the same map and were now laying them against each other to find where they aligned. She knew the names. He knew the money. Together, the picture was complete enough to be catastrophic. By 2 in the morning, he had sent 4 separate encrypted packages to 4 separate recipients. A journalist embedded in the federal court system who owed Kael a debt that had nothing to do with money, a forensic accountant whose work had dismantled 2 previous criminal networks and who asked no questions about sourcing, a contact inside the state attorney general's office who had survived this long precisely because she had never been entirely corruptible, and a former federal investigator now in private practice whose name appeared nowhere in Vale's network and whose reputation for thoroughness was the kind that made people in positions of protected corruption genuinely afraid. He didn't tell Seraphine who he'd sent the packages to. She didn't ask. She understood, he was learning, that operational security was not secrecy between them, but a structural principle. The fewer nodes in a network that held complete information, the fewer points of failure. She had been operating on this principle alone for 4 years. Working with someone else required only minimal adjustment. At 3, she fell asleep in the chair. He noticed because the quality of the room changed. The particular quality of alertness she maintained while awake had a texture to it that he'd become attuned to without intending to. And when it went absent, it left a different kind of quiet. He looked at her across the table. Her head had dropped to one side against the chair back. Her arms crossed over her chest in a posture that was, even in sleep, faintly defensive, and her face without its waking vigilance was younger. Not softer, just younger. The lines of exhaustion were still there. But the specific, constant calculation that animated her features while she was conscious had gone briefly offline, and what remained was the face of a person who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time. He got up and retrieved a blanket from the hall closet and placed it over her with the careful, minimal movement of someone aware that she slept the way people slept, who had learned that sounds in the night had meanings. She didn't wake. He went back to his desk and kept working. The first response came at 7:15 the next morning, not from any of his 4 recipients, but from Dominic, who called rather than messaged, which meant it was too large for text. "The surveillance on the Vale Holdings properties," Dominic said. "We found something. Tell me." "The facility on Archer Road, the one licensed as a residential therapeutic center." A pause with weight behind it. "It's not empty, Kael." The specific phrasing of it landed before the content did. "How many?" Kael said. "We're still counting. Our people made entry at 6 this morning when the overnight staff rotated out. There was a window, about 40 minutes. What they found was—" Dominic stopped. In 15 years, Dominic Farah had not stopped mid-sentence when delivering intelligence. "There are children in there." The room was very quiet. "Ages," Kael said. His voice had gone to a register he rarely used. Not louder, but stripped of everything except the factual. Youngest visible, maybe 9 or 10. Oldest teenagers. Our people counted at least 14 before they had to pull back. Another pause. "They're being held under medical pretense. Paperwork, staff uniforms, the whole structure. From the outside, from any official inspection, it reads as a licensed care facility." "Who signed the licensing?" 3 separate judicial reviews over 8 years, all through Vale's court. Kael stood up from his desk. He moved to the window and looked out at the morning harbor, and stood there with the phone against his ear and breathed through what was moving through him. Not shock, because he had read the notebook and understood the direction, but the specific clarifying fury that came from theory becoming concrete, from a pattern becoming faces. "Pull them out," he said. "Kael, that's not the exposure risk. Pull them out." He said it the same way both times. Same register, same pace. "Get them out of that building today and get them somewhere I trust. Call Mira." Mira Solan ran a network of transition housing that operated in the city's margins and had never in 10 years asked Kael where the people he sent to her had come from or what they'd survived. "Tell her I'm calling in every favor she's ever owed me and a few she hasn't accumulated yet." "If Vale's people see movement at that facility—" "Good," Kael said. "Let them see it. Let them know we know." He ended the call and stood at the window and looked at the harbor. Behind him, he heard the chair creak. He turned. Seraphine was awake, the blanket folded neatly in her lap, her eyes open and already at full operational intensity. the sleep having cleared from her face with the speed of someone whose nervous system had long since stopped allowing for gradual transitions. She had heard enough. "How many facilities?" she said. "We have confirmed one. There are at least 3 more properties in the notebook with similar licensing structures." She stood up. The blanket fell to the chair. "There are 5, she said. I documented 5. I didn't know what was in all of them. I knew what was in 2. She looked at him with the specific steadiness of someone saying something they have held for a long time and needed to say once clearly and then put down. "I couldn't get them out. I didn't have the resources. I tried twice to find a way, and both times it—" She stopped. Her jaw worked once. "I tried." "I know," he said. "Don't say that like it's enough." "I'm not saying it's enough. I'm saying I know." He looked at her. "We're getting them out today. All of them, from every facility we can confirm. I need the addresses from your documentation. All 5. She was already moving toward the table where the notebook lay. The operation to empty the 5 facilities took 11 hours and required more coordination than anything Kael had deployed in 4 years. He pulled resources from 3 separate cities, called in obligations that had been accumulating for years, and directed everything through Dominic with the flat, continuous efficiency of a man who had decided that speed was more important than elegance and that the consequences could be managed afterward. He did not leave the penthouse. Seraphine did not leave the penthouse. They stood at his operations table, a secondary surface he had assembled in the living room with laptops and encrypted communication lines, and managed incoming intelligence with a division of labor that had established itself without discussion. He made the structural decisions. She caught the details he missed because she knew the geography of her father's network from the inside in ways his 6 years of external investigation had never fully accessed. At one point, Marco called with a location question, and Seraphine answered it before Kael could. A cross street, a building entrance, a code for the rear security panel that she provided from memory without hesitation. Marco was silent for 2 seconds on the line, processing the voice he hadn't expected. "Copy that," Marco said, and the professionalism of it was its own form of acknowledgement. By 6 in the evening, Dominic confirmed that 4 of the 5 facilities had been emptied. The 5th, the largest, the one on Renfield Avenue with the most complete legitimate-seeming infrastructure, had been vacated by Vale's people before Kael's team arrived. Someone had warned them. Kael stood with his phone in his hand and looked at the map on the laptop screen and felt the specific cold clarity that came from understanding that the operation had a leak. "Who knew the full list of facilities?" he said. Dominic's voice was careful. "On our end. You, me, the 4 team leads. That's it." The team leads knew their individual targets, not the full list. "Correct." "Then it came from somewhere else." He looked at Seraphine. She was looking at the map with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not quite recognition, but something adjacent to it. Something she was working through. "What?" he said. She looked up at him. "I gave you 5 addresses last night." "Yes." "I pulled them from memory. I've never written them down in the same place before." She paused. "The Renfield location. I documented it differently from the others. Separate notation system. If someone with access to the full notebook had cross-referenced..." She stopped. "The notebook hasn't left this room," Kael said. "I know." They looked at each other across the operations table. "The other 4 facilities' addresses," she said slowly. "Those were in the main section. They were accessible if anyone had access to the notebook in the last 12 hours. Her eyes moved briefly, involuntarily, toward the corridor that led to the penthouse's secondary entrance. Kael said, "Soren." He said it quietly. He didn't move immediately. He stood with the phone in his hand and worked through the structural implications of what he was considering. The timeline, the access points, the specific information windows, with the precision of someone who had made this kind of assessment before and understood that speed without accuracy was worse than slowness. Then he put the phone down and walked to the security panel by the main door and pulled up the access log for the last 24 hours. Soren had been in the penthouse at 11:47 the previous night. His keycard entry was logged at the secondary corridor entrance. Duration of stay, 4 minutes. Logged exit. Kael had been at his desk. Seraphine had been asleep in the chair. The notebook had been on the table between them, closed, but present. 4 minutes was enough. He stood at the security panel for a moment. Then he called Dominic. "Soren," he said, a pause that was 3 seconds longer than Dominic's pauses usually were. "I'll find him." "Find him fast," Kael said, "before Vale's people do, because if they reach him first, I lose the information about what he gave them and when." He ended the call and stood with his back to the room and breathed through the specific, familiar nausea of betrayal. Familiar not because it happened often, but because when it happened in his world, it always carried the same specific weight. Not surprise, not hurt, exactly. Something more corrosive, the retroactive contamination of trust, the way it moved backward through time and recolored every interaction you'd had with the person in its new and accurate light. 9 years. Soren had been with him for 9 years. He turned around. Seraphine was watching him from across the room with the steady, unsparing attention that was simply how she saw the world. She didn't offer comfort, and she didn't offer analysis. She just looked at him with the full, direct presence of someone who understood exactly what this moment cost. "I'm sorry," she said. 2 words, flat and genuine, with none of the performance that apologies usually carried. "Don't be," he said. "It's information. It's more than that." "Yes," he said, "but right now it's information first." Soren was found at 10 that night in a parking structure 2 miles from the penthouse. He was alive. He was, when Dominic's people brought him to the secondary location Kael used for conversations that couldn't happen in the penthouse, in the condition of someone who had made a decision and was prepared to account for it. Not the defensive, scrambling affect of someone caught, but the compressed, over-controlled demeanor of someone who had been afraid for a long time and had finally done the thing the fear had been building toward. Kael sat across from him at a bare table in a room with cement walls and one overhead light and looked at the man who had driven him for 9 years and felt, underneath the cold, analytical attention he was deploying, a specific dull ache that he recognized as grief and set aside. "Who approached you?" Kael said. Soren looked at the table. "Voss." "When?" 8 weeks ago." He looked up. "Before the wedding." "What did they offer you?" "My brother's debt." Soren's jaw was tight. He borrowed money from Garant's lending arm 6 years ago. The interest doubled twice. It was going to kill him. They were going to... What did they ask for? Soren was quiet for a moment. Access logs, movement schedules, nothing that felt... He stopped himself. Something crossed his face that was not quite shame and not quite defiance. The notebook was different. I didn't know what was in it until I saw the addresses. I recognized one of them. "Renfield," Kael said. "My niece." Soren's voice broke on the second word, and he reassembled it immediately, with visible effort. "She went missing 14 months ago, filed as a runaway. I recognized the address from a description she gave me once in a phone call before..." He stopped again. His hands on the table were very still. "I didn't know what to do with it. Voss's people said they'd find her if I kept cooperating. They said she was fine. They said..." "She's out," Kael said. Soren looked up. "The facility was emptied today. If she was in there, she's out." Kael looked at him with the flat, unflinching attention that was simply how he occupied a room. "Whether she's actually fine is something I can't tell you yet. But she's not in that building." Something happened in Soren's face that was too large and too private to observe directly. Kael looked at the table for a moment and let it happen. Then he said, "What else did you give them?" And Soren told him. All of it. With the specific, complete transparency of someone who has been holding a weight that was always too heavy and has finally been given permission to set it down. It took 40 minutes, and by the end of it, Kael had a full accounting of the intelligence that had moved from his operation to Voss's network over 8 weeks. The timeline of the wedding planning, Seraphine's presence in the penthouse, the surveillance gaps in the building's external coverage, and, most critically, the identities of 2 of the 4 recipients Kael had sent intelligence packages to the previous night. The forensic accountant, the journalist. Both compromised before the packages even arrived. Kael sat with this information for a long moment. "The other 2 recipients," he said. "Did Voss ask specifically about them?" "He asked for the full list. I only saw 2 names." Soren met his eyes. I didn't see the other two. I didn't know them. That's the truth. Kael looked at him for a long moment. He believed him. Not because Soren had demonstrated trustworthiness. He hadn't. For 8 weeks he categorically hadn't. But because the architecture of the deception was consistent with what Soren could access and what he couldn't, and the specific way a man tells a truth he knows is insufficient was different from the way he tells a lie. And Kael had been reading those differences for a very long time. He stood up. You're going to stay here tonight. Tomorrow, you're going to give Dominic a complete written account of every communication with Voss. Dates, methods, content, everything. After that, he stopped. He looked at Soren, who was looking at the table again with the hollowed-out expression of someone awaiting a sentence. After that, I'll find out what happened to your niece, and I'll tell you myself. What comes after that depends on what happened to her. Soren looked up. Kael left the room. In the car on the way back to the penthouse, alone for the first time in 36 hours, he ran the damage assessment in his head with the mechanical precision of someone cataloging a destroyed structure to determine what, if anything, remained load-bearing. 2 of his 4 intelligence recipients were blown. Vale's network had warning on the facility operations, had evacuated the Renfield site, and now had a clear picture of the scope of Kael's move against them. Voss would be in communication with Vale within hours if he wasn't already. The coordinated pressure on Kael's operations, the shipping container, the burning car, the message carved into Cutter, would almost certainly escalate in response to today's facility extractions. And somewhere in the city, the 2 recipients whose identities Soren hadn't known, the State Attorney General's contact and the former federal investigator, were sitting with packages that were now the only undamaged channels Kael had into any official accountability structure. He needed to move faster than Vale could react. He needed to hit everything simultaneously. He needed Seraphine's full documentation, organized and transmitted in a form that could survive legal scrutiny, to reach both untouched recipients before Vale's people identified who they were. He was on the phone with her before the car reached the building. The packages I sent last night, he said. 2 of the 4 recipients are compromised. A beat. Which 2? The journalist and the accountant. Another beat, shorter. The other 2? Still clean as far as I can confirm. Then we have hours, she said, not days. Her voice had the focused, forward-moving quality of someone who has already moved past the loss and is operating on what remains. I need to reformat the documentation. The original notebook format is comprehensive, but it won't survive a legal challenge without supporting cross-references. I need 4 hours and access to your secure printer. You have both, he said. There's something else. A brief pause. Not hesitation. He was learning to distinguish between her pauses, and this one was the pause of someone choosing sequencing rather than weighing disclosure. The document I was reading the morning after the wedding, the one you saw but didn't ask about. I'm asking now. It was a sealed case file from 6 years ago, federal jurisdiction. Another pause. A case that was filed and closed within 3 months. A case involving the sale of a minor to a private detention network operating through medical licensing. He heard her breath steady through the phone. The minor's name was redacted. The judicial signature on the closure order was my father's. She paused once more. The filing date was 4 months after your brother was taken. The car was moving through the night city. Street lights moved across the windows in slow, regular intervals. Seraphine, he said. The case reference numbers cross-matched to 2 of the Garante network's known operational identifiers in my notebook, she said. I've been trying to confirm the connection for 3 years. I wasn't sure until I saw your operational files 2 nights ago. Her voice was as level as it had ever been, but underneath the levelness was something tectonic, the quality of a person delivering information they have carried alone for a very long time. Kael, your brother wasn't handed to federal law enforcement. He heard himself breathing. The federal prosecution that your brother was delivered to, it was a shell. Vale created it. It ran for 4 months and closed without conviction or sentencing record because it was never a real prosecution. She stopped. Your brother was moved through the same network as the facilities we emptied today. The car stopped at a light, red. The city outside the window continued its indifferent motion. He was sold, Kael said. The words came out completely flat. Not the flatness of control, but the flatness of a man standing at the edge of something so large he couldn't find the emotional register adequate to it. Vale didn't give him to the government, he sold him. Yes, Seraphine said. The light changed. The car moved forward. The closure order on the federal case, he said. 6 years ago. Yes. My brother would be 29 now. She said nothing. She didn't offer the kindness of false probability or the cruelty of confirmed probability. She let the silence hold the space that was his to occupy. He sat in the back of the car and looked at the city moving past the window and felt the full, restructuring weight of what 6 years of his life had been built on. The specific shape of the wrong he had been avenging, the target he had been aiming at, the understanding he had organized every decision around. Disassemble itself with the quiet, complete thoroughness of a building whose foundation has been removed. He had thought Vale had betrayed Dario to the federal government. He had thought the worst thing Vale had done to his family was sentence Dario to prosecution and imprisonment. He had spent 6 years building toward revenge for the wrong crime. The real crime was larger. The real crime was still happening, and the woman he had married as an instrument of his revenge had known, not everything, but enough, and had been trying alone for 4 years to build something that could stop it. I'm almost at the building, he said. I know, she said. I can see the car on the entrance camera. He almost said something. He stopped himself. Whatever needed to be said about Dario, about the 6 years, about the specific quality of what had just been destroyed, and what needed to be built in its place, none of it belonged in the next 4 hours. The next 4 hours belonged to the documentation and the 2 remaining clean recipients and the window of time before Vale understood the full extent of what was moving toward him. Start the reformatting, he said. I'll be up in 3 minutes. He ended the call. The car pulled into the building's underground entrance. Kael sat for a moment in the stopped vehicle with his phone in his hand and did something he had not done in a very long time. He allowed himself for 60 seconds to simply feel the full weight of what he now knew, without managing it, without converting it to action, without the protective translation of grief into function. Dario. 23 years old, 6 years ago. Dark-haired, quick-tempered, laughed too loud in quiet restaurants. Had been studying architecture before everything came apart. Had called Kael from a borrowed phone 3 days before he disappeared, and the last thing he'd said was, I'll be fine, stop worrying. And Kael had believed him because the prosecution had seemed real, and the lawyer had seemed real, and the entire structure had seemed real because it had been built by a man who had spent 30 years perfecting the construction of things that seemed real. 60 seconds. Then Kael got out of the car. He rode the elevator to the 43rd floor with his hands at his sides, and his face arranged in the expression that had no name, but that everyone who had ever worked for him recognized as the face that meant the calculation was complete, and what came next was not reaction, but execution. The doors opened. He walked to the penthouse and entered with his keycard, and found Seraphine at the operations table with the notebook open and her laptop running and a yellow legal pad covered in a dense, organized hand. She looked up at him when he came in. He looked at her. This woman who had known something about his brother for 3 years and had been trying to find someone she could trust with it, who had been surviving inside the same architecture that had destroyed his family, who had said, I tried with the flat, unflinching honesty of someone who had stopped needing to be forgiven a long time ago. What do you need from me? He said. She looked at him for one moment with those dark, clear eyes. Then she turned back to the legal pad. Sit down, she said. We have 4 hours. He sat down, and somewhere across the city, in the townhouse with the cameras and the private line and the brandy, Aldrich Vale received a call from Renner Voss that lasted 7 minutes, and when it ended, he stood at his study window for a long time looking at the city that had protected him for 30 years and understood, for the first time with something close to real clarity, that the man he had maneuvered into marrying his daughter had just discovered what had happened to his brother. Vale set his glass down. He picked up a different phone, one that Voss didn't know about, one that connected to a number that only 2 people in the world had, and he made a single call. When the call connected, he said only, It's time. Take her back. And in the penthouse 43 floors above the harbor, Seraphine Vale bent over her legal pad with her pen moving in fast, precise strokes, and had no idea that the 4 hours she and Kael thought they had just become. The call came at 2:17 in the morning, Not to Kael's phone, not to the penthouse line. To the secondary encrypted channel that only 6 people in the world had access to, and the sound of it, a single, flat tone that repeated 3 times and stopped, brought Kael up from his chair with the speed of a man whose nervous system had been running on operational alert for so long that sleep had become simply a lower register of watchfulness. Seraphine looked up from the legal pad. He was already at the secondary terminal. The message was 4 words from Dominic. "She's not there. Go." He read it twice. Then he turned and looked at Seraphine with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Not the cold, analytical stillness, not the compressed fury of the last 72 hours, but something rawer and more structural, the face of a man whose worst calculation had just been confirmed. "They're coming for you," he said. "Right now. Tonight." She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. "Dominic had a contact inside Vale's personal security detail," Kael said, moving to the weapons cabinet on the study's east wall, entering the code with 2 fingers, pulling the door open. "The contact just went dark. That's the signal they agreed on." He turned and looked at her. "Your father made a call tonight. We didn't know about the line. We didn't know about the person on the other end of it." "How many?" she said. "Unknown. Minimum 4, probably more." He was checking the weapon in his hand with the fast, practiced movements of muscle memory. Magazine, chamber, safety. He held a second one out to her across the distance of the room. "Do you know how to use this?" She crossed the room and took it from him, and her hands were steady, and she checked it the same way he had. Magazine, chamber, safety, and the speed of it told him everything. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12, she said. "He wanted me to understand that access to a weapon doesn't equal power when the person with the weapon doesn't want to use it on the people who matter." She looked at him over the gun. He was wrong about that. Kael's phone went off. Marco calling, which meant the building's external surveillance had already registered something. "Talk," Kael said. 3 vehicles, Marco said. His voice had the compressed, rapid quality of someone reporting under time pressure. "West side of the building, parking structure entrance. They're not hiding it. Professional movement, staggered deployment, 2 men ahead on foot, the rest staying with the vehicles." A pause. "There's something else. East entrance. 1 vehicle, stationary, engine running, different crew." "How many total?" "We count 11, maybe 12. 11 or 12. Against the penthouse's 3-person security rotation, 4 with Marco." And Kael. "Get Dominic," Kael said. "He's already moving. 20 minutes out." 20 minutes. He looked at Seraphine. She was looking at him with the focused, forward-leaning attention of someone running parallel calculations. "There are 11 people coming into this building," he said. "I heard," she said. "I need you to tell me right now if there's anywhere in your father's operational network that offers any kind of leverage. Anything that would make them stop or slow down before Dominic arrives." She thought for exactly 2 seconds. "Voss controls the team, not my father directly. My father doesn't like proximity to operational details. Voss commands through a handler named Crew. If Crew goes down early or loses communication with Voss, the team loses its primary instruction channel." She paused. "Crew will be in the east vehicle. He always manages from the perimeter. He doesn't go inside." Kael looked at her. "You know Crew." "He came to the house," she said, and the flatness of it closed the subject completely. He turned to the window. 43 floors down, the building's west face was dark and quiet in the way that things were dark and quiet right before they weren't. He could see the edge of the parking structure from this angle. Not the vehicles, but the ambient change in shadow that meant people were moving where people shouldn't be moving at 2 in the morning. "Wake Soren," he said. A pause from Marco on the phone. He knows this building. He knows their methodology. Wake him and put him on the monitoring station." He paused. "His niece is confirmed out. Tell him that first, then wake him." They hit the lobby at 2:31. Kael knew it from the way the building's internal alert system changed frequency. A sound most people would have missed entirely, a single additional tone in the ambient security hum that the penthouse's modified panel translated into a scrolling red indicator at the bottom of the monitoring screen. He was watching the screen. Seraphine was beside him, close enough that he could feel the heat coming off her arm. "Lobby breach," he said. Stairwell or elevator, she said. Both. He turned from the screen. They'll take the elevators to 38 and come up the stairs from there. Standard approach for a high-floor target. Avoid the camera blind spots in the upper elevator shafts. He looked at her. Come with me. They moved through the penthouse together. Not running, not yet, but fast and low and with a specific economical movement of people who have already made peace with the next 10 minutes being the worst 10 minutes available. He took the north corridor, she took his left shoulder, and they reached the secondary stairwell door. The maintenance access, the one that didn't appear on the building's standard fire plan, and he pushed it open and they went through into the dim, concrete smell of the service stairs. He had prepared this 2 years ago for a threat that never materialized. He had mapped every maintenance corridor, every service access, every camera dead zone in the building's infrastructure with the patient, long-view thoroughness that had kept him alive longer than most men in his position. He had never explained this to anyone except Dominic. Now he talked Seraphine through it in a rapid, low voice as they moved. Service corridor connects to the mechanical floor at 41. From 41, there's a maintenance ladder to the roof access panel. If the lobby breach escalates past containment, the roof is the secondary position. There's a hard line up there connected directly to Dominic's channel. He paused at the landing, listening. Below them, the stairwell was silent. If we get separated, we don't get separated, she said. If we do, we don't. She looked at him in the dim light with the flat certainty of someone who has already done the math. I'm not going back to a position where I'm alone and waiting for someone else to determine what happens to me. Not tonight. Not again. He looked at her for a moment. Okay, he said. His phone vibrated. Marco. He answered it with the phone pressed tight to his ear, volume low. They're at 38, Marco said. 4 in the stairwell, 3 in the east elevator. The east elevator's rigged. They've bypassed the floor stop. It's coming straight to 43. Where are you? Corridor outside the penthouse entrance, me and Garrett. A pause with something jagged in it. Kael, these aren't street-level muscle. They're moving like they've done this in actual buildings. I know, Kael said. Hold the corridor. Do not let them reach the penthouse door before I tell you to engage. And if they're already there, then engage, he said, and ended the call. He looked at Seraphine. Change of plan. They went back up rather than down. It was the decision that the geometry of the situation forced. 4 coming up the stairwell below, 3 in the elevator coming directly to 43, the maintenance floor above offering the only position of concealment that hadn't already been penetrated. He moved fast, and she matched him stride for stride on the stairs without complaint and without hesitation, and he found himself in the compressed, tunnel vision present tense of a situation that was actively trying to kill him, aware of her as something other than a variable he was responsible for. She moved like someone who had been waiting for the moment when the long, forced passivity of her life collapsed into something that required action, and the waiting was over, and she was here. They reached the maintenance floor at 41. He pushed through the fire door, and they entered the low, machinery-loud space of the building's mechanical level, the HVAC units, the elevator shafts, the water mains, and he moved left and she moved right by instinct, clearing angles, which was either trained behavior or the survival instinct of someone who had spent years doing the mental version of this in every room she entered. His phone went off again. Not Marco. Dominic. 12 minutes, Dominic said. I'm pushing. You have 12 minutes to be less than 12 minutes, Kael said. The east vehicle. Crew. Your wife was right. He's running the team by radio. I have a man on him, but I need your authorization to move before your containment window. Move, Kael said. He put the phone away and looked across the mechanical level at Seraphine, who was positioned behind one of the large HVAC housings with the gun at low ready and her back to solid steel, watching the fire door they'd come through. Her hair had come partly loose, and her face in the greenish industrial lighting had the high cheekboned, stripped-down quality of a person at full operational intensity. No wasted attention, no wasted movement, every resource available directed at the next 2 seconds. He thought about the corridor floor at 2 a.m, 6 days ago. Her sitting with a kitchen knife and her knees pulled up, writing out something internal. The distance between that and this was not the distance he would have predicted. The fire door burst open. 2 men came through fast and low, professional spacing, covering each other's entry, and both of them registered Kael's position at the same moment Kael registered theirs. And the next 4 seconds were the kind of 4 seconds that compressed into something that the body remembered long after the mind had processed them. Kael moved left and down behind the water main housing as the first shot punched into the steel above his shoulder with a sound like a struck bell. And he came up and fired twice, the first shot catching the nearer man in the upper arm, spinning him, the second missing as the target dropped. And then the second man was repositioning and Kael was moving again. The limited sight lines of the mechanical floor both protecting him and limiting him, the machinery noise absorbing sounds that would have been deafening in a quieter space. A shot from his right. Seraphine. The second man went down to one knee, hand going to his side, and Kael crossed the distance in 3 steps and ended the threat with a single controlled strike to the back of the skull, not lethal, but immediate. And the man went down and stayed down. He looked at Seraphine. She was looking at the man on the floor with the gun still raised and her chest moving in the fast, controlled rhythm of physical exertion managed. Her hands had not shaken. She lowered the weapon with deliberate slowness. "You've done that before," he said. "I've been waiting to do that before," she said. "There's a difference." His phone. Marco's voice was different now, compressed into the register that meant proximity to serious violence. "They're through the penthouse entrance, 2 of them. Kael, the door." Gunfire through the phone, then static, then nothing. Walk in. He made the decision in under a second. The stairwell down was compromised. The elevator was compromised. The maintenance ladder to the roof was the only remaining clean vertical, and the hard line to Dominic's channel was up there. And Dominic was 11 minutes away, and Marco and Garrett were in the penthouse with 2 armed men and had just gone silent. And the 2 men on the mechanical floor, one down with a hole in his arm, one down with a concussion, would either have backup coming or would wake up, and the entire building below him was compromised from the lobby to the 43rd floor. 11 minutes. "Roof," he said. They moved. The maintenance ladder was at the north end of the mechanical floor, behind a locked gate that Kael opened with a key that lived on his keychain between his car key and the key to his secondary office. He went up first, fast, pulling himself through the hatch at the top and coming out into the open air of the roof, the city spreading out in every direction below them. The harbor to the east still dark and the bridges lit up in long yellow strings, and the sky above the city doing what city skies did. Not dark enough for stars, not light enough for dawn, that particular urban orange-gray that meant humans were burning something somewhere in every direction. He reached down and she took his hand and came through the hatch and straightened up beside him on the roof, and they both stood still for a moment, breathing hard, assessing. The roof was clear. He moved to the north parapet where the hard line was housed in a weatherproof box bolted to the concrete. He pulled it open and grabbed the handset. "Dominic, I'm here." Dominic's voice on the hard line had the quality of sound that didn't depend on signal strength. Solid, present, without the compression of mobile. 8 minutes. I'm on the bridge. Marco went dark. A beat. I know. I have a secondary feed from the penthouse panel. He's down, but he's breathing. The 2 men inside, Garrett engaged one, the other is still active inside the penthouse. The documentation, Kael said. Still transmitting, Dominic said immediately. I started the remote transfer the moment the lobby breach registered. Both clean recipients are receiving. The Attorney General's contact confirmed receipt 4 minutes ago. A pause. The federal investigators channel is still open. The transfer is 73%. 73%. He did the math. The files were large. Seraphine had spent 4 hours reformatting and cross-referencing, adding supporting documentation to every claim, building the kind of evidential structure that couldn't be dismissed on procedural grounds. Large files, clean channel, but 27% remaining. How long, he said. 4 minutes. Maybe 5. He had 8 minutes until Dominic arrived. 4 until the transfer completed. And somewhere below him, inside his penthouse, one of Vale's people was active and mobile, and the documentation was transmitting from Kael's secure terminal, and if that terminal was physically destroyed before transmission completed, Seraphine. He turned. She was 3 feet behind him, watching the roof hatch. The terminal in the penthouse. I need it to stay operational for 4 minutes. If they find it and destroy it before the transfer completes, I know what that means, she said without turning. Dominic can hold them from the outside once he arrives, but that's 8 minutes. And the transfer is 4. She turned now. She looked at him across the roof in the orange city dark with the gun in her hand and her hair loose in the wind coming off the harbor, and her face had the specific quality it had when she had looked at every piece of information available and arrived at a conclusion she was going to act on regardless of the cost. The stairwell from the roof connects to 42. There's another maintenance corridor from 42 to the penthouse service entrance. The man inside doesn't know this building the way you do. Seraphine, how long until Dominic has eyes on the perimeter? 3 minutes. Then for 3 minutes, you hold this position and maintain the hard line with Dominic, and I go in through the service entrance and I keep whoever is in there away from the terminal until the transfer completes. She was already moving toward the stairwell access at the far end of the roof. You know I can do this. You watched me do the mechanical floor. The mechanical floor was 2 men in a wide space with cover. The penthouse is a space I've been memorizing for 6 days, she said. She stopped at the stairwell door and looked back at him. I know where every piece of furniture is. I know every sight line. I know the places where the floor creaks and the places where it doesn't. A pause. He doesn't know me, but I know him. I know what men like him do in spaces they think belong to them. He stood on the roof in the city-lit dark and looked at her and felt every competing calculation run itself out to its conclusion simultaneously, and none of them arrived at an option that was better than the one she was proposing, and some of them arrived at options that were worse in ways he couldn't accept. The service entrance code is 9247, he said. Something in her face, brief, involuntary, the nearest she had come in 6 days to something that might have been called gratitude if it hadn't been too self-sufficient for that word. Don't let Dominic be late, she said. She went through the door and it closed behind her, and he stood on the roof and pressed the handset to his ear. Dominic, 6 minutes. Move faster. He stood at the north parapet and watched the bridge and the harbor and the city burning its ambient orange into the sky. And below him, inside the building, Seraphine Vale was moving through the dark of a service corridor toward a man who had been sent by her father to erase her. And the documentation that could end everything her father had built was 7374, 75% complete and moving toward 2 people who didn't know the woman who had built it over 4 years of careful, solitary, furious survival. His phone vibrated. Unknown number. He answered it. Mr. Virelli. A voice he'd never heard. Older, accustomed to stillness. The voice of someone who had been in the same room with very large stakes for a very long time. My name is Aldrich Vale. I think it's time we spoke directly. Kael said nothing. He looked at the harbor. You've made an extraordinary mess, Vale said. His voice was almost conversational. Almost. Underneath the calibrated calm was something Kael recognized. The tone of a man who was managing something that was no longer entirely manageable and had decided that the best available performance was equanimity. My people are in your building. My documentation is being transmitted to people who will, I grant you, create significant problems for me over the next several months. You've emptied 4 facilities that I'm now going to have to rebuild through alternative structures. A brief pause. But you don't know where my daughter is. Kael went still. She was on your roof, Vale continued, approximately 90 seconds ago. She is no longer on your roof. The man you thought was inside your penthouse came out through the fire escape on the 39th floor 12 minutes ago, which means the man who went through the service entrance she used, the service entrance you gave her the code to, was not the man you thought. Everything Kael had managed, contained, and organized in the last 8 minutes disassembled itself in under a second. She's already in a vehicle, Vale said. She's already moving, and the channel your documentation is transmitting through has just experienced a technical interruption that will be very difficult to explain to the 2 recipients currently watching their screens go dark. He paused one final time. I told you weeks ago, through Mr. Voss, to think of her as temporary. You chose not to listen. I hope the choice was worth the cost. The line went dead. Kael stood on the roof of his building with the dead phone in one hand and the Dominic handset in the other and looked at the bridge where Dominic's vehicles were crossing toward him, still 4 minutes away, and felt something move through him that he had never in his adult life allowed to get this close to the surface. Not grief, not rage, but the specific, Devastating combination of the two that arrives when something you didn't fully understand you valued is taken from you at the exact moment you understood it. He pressed the handset. Dominic. 2 minutes. I can see the building. She's in a vehicle. Moving. I need every camera feed in the city's south quarter on every road leading out from this building right now. I need the vehicle crew came in tracked from the moment it left the east entrance. And I need you to understand that whatever we were doing before tonight is over. His voice was entirely flat and entirely cold, and underneath it was something that people who had known Kael Virelli for 15 years had never heard from him before. Something unmanaged and uncontained and entirely, completely personal. We're not building toward Vale anymore. We're done building. We go at him tonight. Everything, all of it, right now. Kael. She documented 4 years of evidence alone in a house that was trying to kill her, he said. She sat on my corridor floor in the dark because it was the only place she could breathe. She reformatted 600 pages of documentation in 4 hours to keep 2 people she'd never met from being able to dismiss it, and she walked back into a building full of armed men to protect a file transfer. He stopped. The city below him moved in its indifferent, continuous way. Find the vehicle. Dominic. A pause. Already running the feeds, Dominic said quietly. Kael looked out at the city, the bridges, the harbor, the orange-gray sky, and the thing he'd been managing since the corridor floor, since the kitchen island, since the moment she'd handed him the notebook across the table with the flat, unadorned gesture of someone who had decided, provisionally and against all available evidence, to trust him with the only thing she had. That thing was no longer being managed. Somewhere in the city, in a moving vehicle, Aldrich Vale's people were taking her back to the place she had spent her entire life trying to leave, and Kael Virelli was done being calculating about it. Where? He said. South on the harbor road, Dominic said, moving fast. 2 vehicles, heading toward a pause, and in the pause, Kael heard Dominic's breath change in the specific way that meant what he was about to say was going to be worse than expected. Kael. The destination on Vale's secondary security contract, the one we pulled from Voss's files last week, the abandoned facility on the coastal road. Kael knew the name before Dominic said it. St. Dorian's, Dominic said. The old psychiatric facility on the cliffside. The one that overlooked the Black Ocean on the city's southern edge. The one that Vale had owned through a holding company for 11 years and had never, in 11 years, done anything with that appeared on any public record. He was already moving toward the stairwell. How far ahead of us, he said. 15 minutes, maybe 20 if we push. Push, Kael said, and went through the door and down into the dark of the building, and the only thing in him now was direction. The stripped down, singular, irrevocable direction of a man who has lost the last available reason for restraint and is moving toward the thing that... The coastal road ran south from the city along the edge of the cliffside. 2 lanes of cracked asphalt pressed between the rock face on the left and a drop to the ocean on the right. And at 2:50 in the morning, it was empty of everything except Dominic's 3 vehicles running without headlights, and the memory of 2 other vehicles that had passed this way 15 minutes ahead of them. Kael sat in the front passenger seat of the lead vehicle and watched the road come out of the dark, in the pale green of the night vision display Dominic's driver was using, and he did not speak. And no one in the vehicle spoke to him, because the quality of what was coming off him in the darkness of the car was the kind of thing that foreclosed conversation entirely. It was not rage in the conventional sense. Rage was hot and imprecise and consumed the person feeling it, along with everything around them. What Kael was operating in was colder than that, and more structured and more dangerous for both qualities. And the men around him understood this without requiring explanation. Dominic was on the phone in the rear seat, conducting 3 simultaneous coordination threads with the flatlined efficiency of a man who had spent 15 years preparing for exactly this category of night. The document transfer, Kael said. Status. Dominic lowered the phone. The interruption Vale's people created was a spoofing block on the transmission channel. My tech ran a bypass 11 minutes ago. The transfer resumed at 73% and completed 4 minutes after that. He paused. Both recipients have the full package. The Attorney General's contact sent a confirmation receipt at 2:47. The federal investigators' channel is still open and active. Kael absorbed this without visible reaction. Vale knows the transfer completed. Probably, Yes. Which means tonight is about elimination, not recovery. He looked at the road. He can't undo what's in those files, but he can remove every living person who can testify to their authenticity. That's how I read it, Dominic said. Seraphine is the primary witness. She built the documentation. Her testimony is what turns files into convictions. He paused. And I'm the person who can speak to Dario. The car went around a long curve in the coastal road, and through the night vision display the shape of St. Dorian's emerged from the cliff ahead of them. A large, low-slung building with an institutional silhouette, its windows dark, its outline broken by the deteriorating additions of different construction periods. It sat on a natural shelf of rock 20 feet above the cliff edge, and beyond it, the ocean was nothing but sound and black depth. Lights inside, the driver said. Lower level. Kael looked. Through two ground-level windows, a thin amber light moved in the pattern of handheld sources, flashlights or lanterns, carried by people navigating an unlit interior. How many vehicles on approach, he said. 2 confirmed, Marco said from the rear seat. Marco had a gauze bandage on his left temple and a hardness in his face that hadn't been there 2 hours ago. He had arrived at the building's roof access 3 minutes after Seraphine disappeared, having walked upright through a penthouse, where 2 armed men had knocked him into a wall and left him breathing on the floor because Vale's operational priority was Seraphine, not Kael's security staff. He had been walking since then with the deliberate, slightly too careful movement of someone managing a head injury through determination rather than recovery. Kael had not told him to stay behind. Both went to the east side of the building, service access. Rear approach, Dominic said to the driver. Come off the road 200 meters before the access path and run parallel through the scrub. The car turned off the road, and the cracked asphalt became rock and dry grass, and the 3 vehicles moved in a loose file through the darkness, running dark, their engines barely audible under the sound the ocean made against the cliff base far below. At 150 meters from the building, Dominic said, Here. They stopped. Kael got out, and the cold off the ocean hit him immediately. Not the temperature cold of winter, but the deep, salt-heavy cold of water that had been dark for a very long time. He stood beside the vehicle and looked at the building and let his eyes adjust past the night vision's residual green and work with what was actually there. 2 lit windows at ground level, 1 lit window on the upper floor that was too bright for a single handheld source, and from somewhere inside the building a sound that the ocean nearly swallowed, voices, or 1 voice, raised in a register that carried authority. 12 men with Dominic. 3 vehicles. 2 vehicles ahead, occupants unknown, but estimated at 4 to 6 each. Kael checked his weapon one more time, looked at Dominic. The upper floor light, he said. That's where she is. Probably, Dominic said. Not probably, Kael said. Dominic looked at him for a moment. Not probably, he agreed. They moved. The building's east service entrance had been forced. The door hung at an angle from a single hinge, and through the gap came the smell of the interior. Old concrete, mildew, the iron-specific cold of spaces that had been sealed and unsealed, and underneath it, something chemical and institutional that had not entirely dissipated in the years since the facility had last functioned as whatever its licensing had claimed it was. Kael went in first, Dominic 2 steps behind him, then Marco, then 8 of the 12 men in staggered pairs. The remaining 4 went around the building's perimeter to cover the exits. Inside, the ground floor was a maze of corridors in varying states of physical decay, ceilings with water damage, floors with the particular slickness of concrete that has absorbed moisture over years, door frames warped, several doors open onto dark rooms that contain nothing except the ghost shapes of removed furniture and the occasional overturned piece of medical equipment. Everything had the quality of a place that had been emptied in a hurry and never returned to. They moved through it without light, navigating by the ambient glow from the lower windows, communicating in hand signals that required no translation. They cleared the east wing in 4 minutes, 2 of Vale's men found in a room near the north corridor, stationed as a rear guard, both neutralized before they had full situational awareness of what had come through the service entrance. No shots fired. The building's acoustics were uncertain, and Kael wanted position before noise. The stairwell at the center of the building was the only viable route to the upper floor. It was also the most exposed point in the structure. Open landings, no cover above the first step, Any movement on the stairs visible from 2 floors up if someone was positioned and looking. Kael stood at the base of the stairs and looked up. The light from the upper floor came down the stairwell in a warm, unsteady bar that moved slightly. Not a fixed source, something with a flame element, or an aging battery. 60-something steps, open landings at the first floor and the second. 2 possible positions of fire above him that he could identify from this angle. From upstairs, the voice again. Closer now, and resolving through the stairwell's vertical acoustics into identifiable speech. Always believed that sentiment was the thing that would destroy you, even as a small child. You felt things too directly. You never learned. He knew the voice. He had never heard it speaking to its daughter before. The difference was something he had not anticipated. The particular intimate quality of contempt between a parent and a child. The way it used the architecture of closeness to deliver the content of negation. He started up the stairs. He moved on the outside edge of each step, where the structural support was closest to the wall and the flex was smallest, and he moved slowly enough that his body weight transferred without sound. Dominic came behind him with the same care. Marco behind Dominic. Midway up the first flight, a creak, unavoidable, a board compromised by water damage that sat in the geometric center of the step and that no amount of edge-hugging could entirely avoid. Kael froze. The voice above stopped. 6 seconds of silence, then, check the stairs. Movement above. A single set of footsteps crossing what sounded like open floor, then a door, then the footsteps coming toward the landing above him. Kael did not go back down. He went up, fast and silent on the instinct that speed was now more valuable than concealment. And he reached the first landing in 3 strides and came around the corner as the man reaching the top of the flight was still processing what he was seeing. And the gun came up in the man's hand, and Kael took the wrist behind it and redirected it, and the shot that fired went into the wall plaster, and then the man was no longer a threat and was no longer standing. The shot sound was catastrophic in the stairwell. No more moving quietly. Go, Kael said, and they went. What? The upper floor was a single long corridor with rooms off both sides, and it was occupied. He assessed this from the landing in the first second after cresting the stairs. 2 men in the corridor, reacting to the shot, both turning toward him, both armed, both starting to raise their weapons. And behind them at the far end of the corridor, a door that was closed and lit at its threshold with the warm, unsteady light he'd seen from outside. What followed was 45 seconds of the most focused violence Kael had engaged in 4 years. In a space too narrow for sophistication and too charged for caution. Dominic took the left, Kael took the right, Marco and the 2 men behind him provided the depth that kept the corridor from becoming a trap. Walls absorbed shots that weren't absorbed by people. Plaster came down in chunks. One of the light fixtures, already cracked, already failing, went dark from a round that clipped its housing, and the corridor became worse than dark. Became strobed by the muzzle flash of continuing exchange. And in the strobing, Kael moved forward through the bodies of men who had been given a job tonight that they had underestimated. 30 seconds, 40, 45. And then silence. Except for Kael's breathing and Dominic's breathing, and somewhere behind him Marco saying a single profane word in a tone that indicated injury rather than catastrophe. Kael was at the door at the end of the corridor. He looked back. Dominic was on his feet. Marco was on his feet with one hand pressed to his right side in a way that Kael had seen before and knew the meaning of. A graze, painful and bleeding, but not the kind of thing that ended a man who decided not to let it. 2 of their 8 were down behind them in the corridor, neither moving. He turned back to the door. He kicked it open and went through. The room had been a medical examination suite in whatever past life the building had claimed. It still had the bones of that function. The central examination chair bolted to the floor, the cabinet frames on the walls, the overhead examination light retrofitted with a battery-powered lamp that threw the room's interior into sharp, high-contrast relief. Someone had cleaned the room's surfaces recently. Not clinically, but enough to make it functional again, which told Kael that this location had been planned well before tonight. This was not improvisation. This was a prepared position that had been waiting for exactly this use. Seraphine was in the examination chair. She was not restrained, not with physical restraints, but the gun that a man was holding 3 feet to her left made the distinction essentially academic. She had a cut above her right eyebrow that had bled down the side of her face and dried, and her hands were in her lap, and she was looking at Kael when he came through the door with an expression that was not relief, not quite. It was something more complicated than that, something that had relief as an element, but also had the specific, scorched quality of someone who has been sitting for the last 40 minutes inside a room with the thing they have survived their entire life and has not broken. Not broken. Standing next to Seraphine's chair, on the opposite side from the man with the gun, was Aldrich Vale. He was 70 years old and he looked like the public record of him. Silver-haired, upright, the kind of face that had spent 3 decades being trusted by people who needed to trust something. The face of a man who had perfected the performance of integrity until it sat on him with the ease of a second skin. He was dressed in a dark suit that was not right for the location, which told Kael that he had dressed tonight for a different kind of occasion, for control, for dignity, for the version of tonight he had planned, which had not included Kael arriving at this room with gunfire in the corridor behind him. For the first time since the wedding, Kael was looking directly at Aldrich Vale. The man looked back at him with the appraising, undisturbed attention of someone who had operated for 30 years in the company of people with guns and had never lost the fundamental conviction that he was the most intelligent person in any room he entered. "Mr. Virelli," Vale said, "you made better time than I expected." Kael said nothing. He was looking at Seraphine, looking at the cut, looking at her hands in her lap. Steady, deliberately still, the stillness of someone managing. "Are you hurt?" he said. To her. Only to her. "I'm functional," she said. Vale made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "She's always functional. That's the one quality I never had to instill. She came with it." He looked at his daughter with the expression of a man assessing livestock. Remarkably durable. Kael looked at Vale then, and whatever Vale saw in that look caused something. Not fear, not quite, but the first visible hairline fracture in the composed surface, to cross his face before he controlled it. "The gun on your left," Kael said. "Tell him to put it down." "I don't think—" "I have 8 men in this building and 4 more on the exits," Kael said. "Every person you brought here is either down or contained. The 2 vehicles on the east side are surrounded. Renner Voss was taken off the street 40 minutes ago and is currently in a location where he is motivated to be very forthcoming." "Dans Santipa months," he paused. "The documentation your daughter built over 4 years transmitted completely to 2 recipients who are not in your network and who have been waiting for exactly this kind of material for their entire careers. By 6 this morning, that documentation will be in the hands of people who have federal jurisdiction and who are not the people you own." He looked at Vale with the flat, total attention that had never once in his adult life been mistaken for anything other than what it was. "The game you've been playing is over. The only remaining question is the quality of what comes next, the gun on your left." Vale's eyes moved briefly to the man with the gun. A calculation happened. Kael watched it happen, watched Vale run the same structural assessment that Kael had just laid out, watched him arrive at the same conclusion, watched him manage the arrival. "Set it down," Vale said to the man. The man hesitated. The hesitation of someone who had been told tonight that failure was not an option and was now being told by the principal to stand down, 2 instructions that didn't resolve cleanly. "Set it down," Vale said again, with the flat authority of someone who had been obeyed for 30 years and had not yet fully processed that the mechanism of that obedience was gone. The gun went on the cabinet surface. Dominic moved into the room behind Kael and covered the distance to the man in 3 steps and removed the weapon and had him against the wall with efficient, impersonal thoroughness. Kael crossed the room to Seraphine. He stopped in front of her and looked at the cut above her eye. Close up. It was a pressure wound rather than a blade wound, the kind that came from contact with a corner or an edge at speed, from being moved through a space faster than was safe. His eyes moved to her face, to the dried blood, to the flat, enduring patience with which she was looking back at him. "I'm okay," she said, quietly, with none of the performance that phrase usually carried. She meant it as a factual statement, and it landed as one. "I know," he said. He was close enough that the word was almost private. Behind him, Aldrich Vale said, "This is touching. The contempt in it was so practiced it came out smooth, almost aesthetic. Although I'm unclear what exactly you think this resolves. You can take her. You were always going to take her. I factored that into the evening. He moved to the room's single window and looked out at the dark ocean below the cliff, with the posture of a man on a balcony, rather than a man in a cornered room. What you cannot do is erase 30 years of infrastructure with a document transfer and a night of violence. What you cannot do is walk away from this building with anything that functions as closure. You'd be surprised, Kael said. Would I? Vale turned from the window. He looked at Kael with the direct, unimpressed attention of someone who has studied an opponent and arrived at his conclusions. You want to talk about your brother. You've wanted nothing else since you found out what actually happened. Say what you came to say. The room was very quiet, except for the ocean. Kael looked at Vale and felt the full weight of the last 6 years organize itself into a single, distilled question that he had been building toward through every decision, every sacrifice, every night he had spent in the cold company of his own patients. Where is he? Kael said. Vale's expression did not change. Alive, he said. Or was, the last I checked, which was some time ago. The network doesn't maintain longitudinal records on individual... Where? Vale studied him. Something moved in the composed surface of his face. Not guilt, not remorse, but something almost like genuine assessment, as if he were deciding for the first time whether the man in front of him merited a real answer. I genuinely don't know, Vale said. That's the truth, and I understand you have no reason to believe it, but it is the truth. The transaction was completed, and the routing was handled by people I no longer have contact with, because those people were among the first to be affected by your operations over the last 72 hours. He paused. Your forensic accountant, if he's as good as his reputation, will find the financial traces. The money moved in a way that can be followed. I kept records, not from conscience, from insurance, and those records are in a location that your documentation hall did not include. Kael stared at him. You kept records of what you did to my brother, he said. I kept records of everything I ever did, Vale said. It's how I survived 30 years. It's how anyone survives 30 years. You of all people should understand that. Where are the records? Vale looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Seraphine. Ask her, he said. The room shifted. Kael turned to Seraphine. She was looking at her father with an expression that had finally shed the last layer of managed blankness and arrived at something truer, something that was not hatred, not in the active, consuming sense, but the cold, clear-eyed recognition of a person looking at the source of their longest damage and seeing it, finally, at its actual size, smaller than it had seemed from inside it, more pathetic, more human, more destructible. He has a secondary archive, she said. Her voice was steady. I've known about it for 2 years. I didn't document its location because I was saving it. She paused. I was saving it for leverage. For the moment when I needed something he valued more than my silence. She looked at Kael. It's in the townhouse, sub-basement level, behind the utilities panel on the north wall. Combination is the date of my mother's death. Her jaw moved once. He thought I didn't know that date. He never talked about her. He thought silence erased things. She held Kael's gaze. It doesn't. Kael looked at Vale. Vale was looking at his daughter with an expression that was the first entirely unperformed thing Kael had seen on his face all night. Something raw and briefly visible. The expression of a man confronting the specific quality of his own failure in the face of the person most comprehensively damaged by it. It lasted 3 seconds. Then he controlled it and the composed surface came back, but it came back slightly wrong, like a mask reapplied in the dark. Remarkable, Vale said quietly. He said it almost to himself. He was still looking at Seraphine. You are remarkable. Don't, she said. Flat. Final. One word carrying 30 years of refusal. Vale closed his mouth. Kael said to Dominic in the doorway, Get a team to the townhouse, sub-basement, north wall, now. He paused. And call the Attorney General's contact. Tell her we have Vale in custody and we're prepared to facilitate a formal transfer to appropriate jurisdiction within the hour. Tell her the secondary archive location. Tell her everything. Dominic was already on his phone. Kael looked at Vale one more time. He had imagined this moment in many forms over 6 years. He had built it in his mind as something complete, a confrontation that would have the structure of resolution, that would deliver the specific satisfaction of a debt finally and fully called. He had imagined himself feeling things in it that he could name and categorize and then set down. What he felt instead was simpler and less gratifying and more true. He felt tired. Tired of the 6 years. Tired of the architecture of revenge, its maintenance costs, the way it required you to stay permanently oriented toward the thing you most wanted to be done with. He felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something for so long that the carrying has become indistinguishable from who he is, and who is now standing at the moment of setting it down and discovering that the act of setting it down feels less like freedom and more like the first moment of an unfamiliar weight. He turned away from Aldrich Vale. He turned towards Seraphine. "Can you walk?" he said. "Yes," she said. "Then let's go." She stood from the examination chair. She stood with the deliberate, self-sustaining quality she brought to everything. No hand offered, no hand taken, simply a person rising under their own authority and finding that their legs held. She was not entirely steady. The adrenaline and whatever she'd absorbed tonight were working through her system, but she was upright, and she was looking at the door, and the direction of her attention was entirely forward. She moved past Kael toward the door. At the threshold, she stopped. She turned back and looked at her father one time. A single, long look that contained everything she had never said in 30 years of compulsory silence. Not the screaming version of it, not the version that needed to become sound to be real, but the version that lived underneath all of that in the structural bedrock of a person who has decided, at some point so fundamental they can't locate the exact moment, that they are not going to be destroyed by the thing trying to destroy them. He looked back at her. And something happened in Aldrich Vale's face that may have been the closest thing to genuine feeling he was still capable of. A brief, terrible opening, a moment of seeing his daughter seeing him, which was perhaps the one experience he had never permitted himself in 30 years of treating her as an instrument. She held it for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked through the door. Outside, the coastal air was brutal and clean. They came out through the building's front entrance. The main doors, which had been chained and were no longer chained, and the night hit them fully. The wind off the ocean, the sound of it against the cliff base, the vast and indifferent dark of the water extending to the horizon. The sky to the east, over the ocean, carried the first suggestion of the change that preceded dawn. Not light yet, but the absence of the deepest dark. A shift in the quality of the black that the body registered before the eyes could articulate it. Kael stood on the cracked concrete of the facility's front approach and breathed. Beside him, Seraphine stood and breathed. She had her arms crossed over her chest, not the defensive crossing of the first days in the penthouse, but the self-containing posture of someone standing in cold wind. Her hair was loose and the wind worked through it. The dried blood above her eyebrow was dark against her skin, and she hadn't touched it since they'd come outside. Around them, Dominic's men moved in the organized post-action way of people securing a completed situation. Vehicles repositioned, communications ongoing. The sounds of a night that was winding down toward its accounting. Neither Kael nor Seraphine spoke for a long time. The wind, the ocean, the quality of the sky changing in the east. "The record's in the sub-basement," she said finally. "If Dario's routing is in there." "It will be," Kael said. "He kept everything. Your accountant, the one whose channel was compromised. If Dominic can clean the compromise." "He's already working on it." He paused. "The financial traces Vale mentioned, they can be followed. It takes time." "How much time?" "I don't know." He said it without dressing it up. "Weeks, maybe longer. The network he was moved through." He stopped. He looked at the ocean. "It's not simple geography, it's a system. Systems can be taken apart if you know where to start. You know where to start now." "Yes." She was quiet again. The wind pushed her hair across her face, and she moved it back with one hand and held it there. And in the gesture, ordinary, human, the gesture of a person standing outside in the wind, something about the last 10 days rearranged itself in Kael's understanding. He had married her to use her. He had used the fact of her to get close to her father. And somewhere between the bathroom doorway and this cliff, in the pre-dawn wind, something had happened that he had not planned and could not have planned because it required the specific collision of two people who had each, separately, been reduced to their most essential components by the things done to them. Stripped of performance, stripped of comfortable self-deception, stripped of the ordinary social insulation that let people avoid knowing each other, and who had, in that stripped-down state, seen each other with a clarity that was almost biological in its directness. He didn't have a clean word for what it was. He had never needed clean words for internal states because he had spent 15 years systematically converting internal states into actionable external decisions, and the conversion was so practiced it had come to seem complete. The thing he was feeling now was evidence that the conversion had never been complete. It had only been efficient. "The scars," he said. She turned and looked at him. "They're yours," he said. "They belong to you, and they don't belong to him anymore. They haven't since before tonight, but—" He stopped. He was not accustomed to this kind of sentence, the kind that moved toward something it couldn't fully articulate and had to trust the recipient to meet it part way. "I wanted to say it out loud. While we're here." She looked at him for a moment with the unsentimental, direct attention that was simply how she saw things. Then she looked back at the ocean. "I know," she said, not dismissively, not defensively. As a fact, received and acknowledged and held. "There are things we haven't talked about," he said. "There are many things," she agreed. "That's going to need to change." She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It is." The eastern sky continued its slow, pre-dawn brightening. Not light yet, but the color of what light was coming to replace. Dominic found them 20 minutes later, standing where they were, and reported that Vale was in transit to a location where a representative of the Attorney General's office would receive him within the hour. The sub-basement team had confirmed the archive's existence and was documenting its contents. Voss was in a room somewhere in the city being comprehensively forthcoming. Marco was in a vehicle with a field dressing on his side, refusing to be taken to a hospital until the situation was fully resolved, and had been arguing with the medic about this for 15 minutes. "Tell him the situation is resolved," Kael said. "He'll want to hear it from you. Tell him I said so." He looked at Dominic. "And tell him good work tonight." Dominic looked at him with the particular expression of a man who has worked for someone long enough to register the small departures. Then he nodded and turned and walked back toward the vehicles. Kael looked at Seraphine. "We should go," he said. "Yes," she said. They walked to the vehicles together across the cracked concrete of St. Dorian's forecourt, and the building behind them was lit now by the working lights of Dominic's team securing and documenting, and it looked, in that functional light, smaller than it had looked in the dark, less than its reputation. Just a building that had been used badly by a person with the power to use things badly, and which now, in the hard light of its aftermath, was simply a problem being processed. In the car they sat together in the back seat, without distance between them. Not the calculated distance of the penthouse's first days, not the negotiated proximity of the operations table, but the natural, unguarded closeness of two people who had been through something together and had come out the other side and were simply sitting, finally, in the shared fact of having come out. She fell asleep before they reached the city. It happened quickly, the way exhaustion finally won after it had been refused for too long, coming in all at once rather than gradually. Her head dropped, found his shoulder, and stayed there with the unconscious trust of a body that had finally decided, somewhere below the level of decision, that this was a safe place to be unguarded. He did not move. He sat in the car as the city reappeared around them. The outer ring roads, then the familiar density of the urban core, then the harbor district with its wet streets and its lights. And he felt the weight of her against his shoulder and the specific, unfamiliar quality of wanting things for the future. Not the operational future, not the planning horizon of next moves and damage control and documentation trails. Something else, something that had no tactical component at all. He had not felt this in a very long time. He was not sure he had ever felt it in exactly this form. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, Aldrich Vale appeared before a federal magistrate in a sealed hearing and was formally charged on 23 counts. The charges had been building since the night of St. Dorian's, each day bringing new elements as the archive was processed, as Voss talked, as the forensic accountant followed the financial traces that Vale had spent 30 years maintaining in the certainty that no one would ever have both the access and the authority to read them correctly. Kael was not in the courtroom. He did not need to be. He was in the penthouse at the kitchen island with coffee, watching the morning harbor light come through the east windows in the particular gold of autumn when Seraphine came in from the hallway and looked at her phone and looked at him. "It's filed," she said. "I know," he said. He'd had the notification 4 minutes before her. She looked at the phone for a moment longer. Then she set it on the counter and poured coffee with the unhurried movements of someone who no longer organized her mornings around the potential for sudden emergency. She sat across the island from him and wrapped both hands around the cup. The morning light was generous to the kitchen. It always was in autumn. The angle of it, the quality of its warmth, the way it made ordinary surfaces look like they had been considered. She had changed things in the kitchen in the 3 weeks since St. Dorian's. Small things. A plant on the east windowsill, a different arrangement of the counter surfaces. The coffee machine moved 18 inches left to where the electrical access was better. He had noticed each change without comment and had found, noticing them, a quiet satisfaction he didn't interrogate. "The secondary archive," she said. "The Dario routing. Carver's team has it down to a 3-year window and 2 probable network nodes," he said. Carver was the forensic accountant, the one whose channel had been compromised and then restored, who had spent 18 consecutive days in a room with Vale's financial records and had emerged from that experience thinner, quieter, and more certain. "He thinks he'll have a geographic location by the end of the month." Seraphine looked at her coffee. "And if Dario is—" She stopped. She looked up at him. "If he's not—" "Then I'll know," Kael said. "Knowing is different from not knowing. It's always different, even when what you know is the worst thing." He paused. "I've been not knowing for 6 years. I'm done with not knowing." She held his gaze. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They sat with the morning and the harbor light and the coffee, and the silence between them was the kind that had no discomfort in it, the kind that had taken 3 weeks to build from the ground of what they'd survived together, and that sat now with the specific, earned quality of silence between people who had seen each other in conditions that stripped all performance away and had decided to stay anyway. There was a conversation still coming. Several conversations. The thing about Dario, what it would mean if Carver found him, what it would mean if he found evidence instead of a person, the question of what came after the finding when the person you'd spent 6 years preparing to avenge was also the person you still needed to grieve. The thing about the future of Kael's operation, the quiet restructuring already underway, the particular routes that had been permanently closed, the new directions of a criminal empire that had, without formal announcement, begun to operate by a different set of principles. The thing about them, what they were becoming, the specific nature of a relationship built on the ruins of manipulation that had somehow, in the process of everything collapsing, produced something real. Those conversations were all coming, but not this morning. This morning was just the light and the harbor and the coffee, and the fact of both of them sitting at the same island they'd stood across from each other 10 days ago, with guns and evidence and 12 people trying to end their lives, sitting now in the ordinary grace of a morning that was simply a morning. "I was thinking," Seraphine said. He waited. "The waterfront estate." She meant the building across the harbor, a property Kael had owned for 4 years and not done anything with. A large, restored commercial building with residential potential on the upper floors that he had purchased for reasons that had been primarily financial and had never developed because his attention had been elsewhere. "If you were going to do something with it—" He looked at her. "The lower floors could be used for something functional," she said, with the careful, forward-leaning quality of someone proposing something they've been thinking about for longer than they're letting on. "The transition housing Mira runs. She's operating out of 3 locations that are too small and badly situated. The waterfront building has better transport access and enough space for—" She stopped. She looked at him with the direct, unsentimental attention that was simply how she looked at things. "I've been thinking about what comes after. What you do with a criminal operation once you've decided it should be something other than just a criminal operation." "And?" he said. "And you're going to have to do something, Kael. You can't run an empire and also decide to have principles. Principles have structural consequences. They require infrastructure. She paused. So I was thinking about the infrastructure. He looked at her across the kitchen island in the autumn morning light. He had married her to hurt her father. She had come to him as the residue of someone else's war, carrying 4 years of evidence and a kitchen knife and the particular unbreakable quality of a person who had decided at some point so fundamental they couldn't locate the moment that they were not going to be destroyed. He had put a blanket over her in the dark. She had answered Marco's question before he could. She had reformatted 600 pages in 4 hours. She had walked into a building full of armed men to protect a file transfer. She had looked at her father for 3 seconds and said one word and closed 30 years of damage with the flat, final authority of someone who had simply decided they were done. He thought about the corridor floor. He thought about the notebook on the table, offered across the distance between two people who had no reason to trust each other, offered anyway. The waterfront building, he said. Yes, she said. Tell me what you're thinking. She looked at him for a moment. Then she set down her coffee cup and reached across the island for the legal pad that had been living on the counter since she'd brought it from the operations table. The same legal pad from the 4-hour documentation session, its front pages dense with her fast, precise handwriting. And she opened it to a blank page and picked up the pen that was sitting on top of it. And she began to explain. He listened with the full, total attention that he gave to things that mattered, and the morning light moved across the kitchen in its unhurried autumn progression. And outside the window, the harbor did what harbors do, carried its traffic, accepted its weather, moved its water from one place to another in the continuous, indifferent motion of something that has been doing this long before the people watching it arrived and will be doing it long after they are gone. The scars on her back were under her shirt. They would always be under her shirt. They would never stop being what they were, the record of what had been done, the physical history of a childhood and a young adulthood that had been someone else's cruelty written on her body in permanent ink. She had not shown them to him again since the first night. He had not asked. The asking would come in its own time, or it wouldn't. And either way, the scars were not the sum of her. They were part of her. The way all the worst things that have happened to a person are part of them, carried rather than worn, present rather than displayed. He thought, with the quiet and specific clarity of a man who had been moving toward something for a very long time and had finally arrived, that he would like to know her for a very long time. Not as a transaction, not as a management problem, not as the collateral consequence of a revenge that had turned out to be aimed at entirely the wrong target. As the person she was, which was considerable, which was extraordinary in ways he was only beginning to adequately inventory, which was, and this was the word he had been avoiding for 3 weeks, because it was the kind of word that changed the shape of things, and he had not been ready for the shape to change, and was ready now, which was his. Not owned, not controlled, nothing like either of those things. His, the way a direction is yours. His, the way a thing you've decided is finally, after everything, worth deciding. She was still talking, he was still listening. The legal pad was filling with her precise, fast handwriting, and the plan she was laying out was good. Genuinely good. Structurally sound, practically detailed in the way that everything she did was practically detailed. And underneath the content of it, he could hear something he had not heard in her voice in the 10 days of their cohabitation. Anticipation. The sound of a person who has arrived, against all available odds, at a morning that contains a future. He picked up his own pen. He pulled the legal pad to an angle where he could read it and she could still write on it. He made a note in the margin of her first page, a question about square footage, a practical thing, the kind of thing that would need to be answered. She looked at his note. She answered it in the margin below it without pausing her explanation. He looked at the answer. He made another note. They worked. The harbor light moved across the kitchen floor in its slow autumn progression, and outside the window the city went about its enormous, continuous, violent, beautiful business. And in the penthouse on the 43rd floor, 2 people who had been built by damage and had survived it and had found each other in the wreckage of the worst plans either of them had ever made, sat at a kitchen island and built something new on the ruins of the old. It was not simple. It would not be simple. Nothing real ever was. But it was morning, and they were both still here. And for the first time in longer than either of them could accurately remember, that was enough.